Story 1.
"It's done," Condor Banks said, lowering his Winchester. The stagecoach, riddled with bullets, lay on its side, and the bodies of the guards were strewn where death had found them. Jack swallowed the lump in his throat. Strangely enough, he felt most sorry for the horse that had been hit by a stray bullet and had just been put down by Winky. No, Scamp did the right thing. The animal wouldn't have survived anyway, and there was no one to treat it. Still, it was a pity about the horse. Those men were armed and knew what they were getting into. The horse was innocent, if one could say that about a horse. A random bullet had wounded it in the flank. And that was it. And Jack loved his bay. Kitch Sanders and Condor quickly hauled out the gold dust. It lay in an iron-bound chest in neat canvas bags. Sanders had broken the lock with a sledgehammer he had brought for the occasion. They divided the gold evenly, securing the heavy bags to their horses' saddles. Everything had been agreed upon in advance, and now the gang was heading to Miles's abandoned farm. That's where they were supposed to get their share. Jack looked at his companions, thinking the same thing they were. Why should some risk their necks while others reap the profits? Read on the men's faces. Yes, they had the gold, but it didn't belong to them. Everything had been organized by Hilderman. The sheriff knew when and where the stagecoach would travel, how much gold there would be, and how many bullets the guards had. He chose the place and time, and he hired them. For that, they had to give up almost everything. They would be left with a quarter, for the four of them. "Boys, I think we're in trouble," Winky said, spitting a long, black stream of chewing tobacco. Jack noticed that his dapper black hat had a bullet hole right above the forehead. "I don't trust him." "Do we have a choice?" Sanders asked. A killer and a card cheat, he had been sitting in the local jail until the sheriff offered him, like the others, to join the job. Kitch had come from the north, was hot-headed and a good shot. It hadn't taken him a couple of months to become a candidate for the gallows. Hilderman knew who to choose. Unlike Sanders, Jack was local and knew the others well. The half-breed Winky, nicknamed Scamp, and Condor Banks. Both were excellent marksmen and daring men. "The sheriff must have counted on a couple of us being killed by the guards," Jack thought as he swayed in the saddle. "But we all survived, and we have the gold." "Kitch, you of all people shouldn't trust Hilderman," Winky replied. Swarthy and sharp-nosed, he sat in the saddle like an Indian and could shoot as well on the run as from solid ground. "And you know why." "Why? You're as dumb as a rifle butt. Why would Hilderman let you out of jail?" "To help you guys," Sanders said, scratching his head. "I'm a damn good shot." "Sure. And then what? What will he tell the grocer's family you killed? That he let you go? That you're innocent? With so many witnesses?" Winky laughed. His teeth were white and sharp, something to behold. And strong. Jack had tried to knock out a couple once. It didn't work, but Winky knocked out one of his fangs. "What are you getting at, Scamp? I don't get it." Condor stopped his horse. "That the sheriff will kill us all, and take the gold for himself." "What?" Jack asked. "You think the sheriff—" "I know it as surely as it's day and not night," Winky said. "The sheriff has no reason to leave him alive." He pointed a finger at Sanders. "That's one. And two, why share if he can take it all and get rid of those who know about the stagecoach robbery? We're a pain in Hilderman's ass as long as we're alive, aren't we?" Condor pushed his hat back. His eyes were black, as was his beard, and Jack couldn't read anything in them. But Banks said nothing. "I don't believe it," Jack said. "Hilderman has never lied to me." "Have you dealt with him many times, Jack?" Winky smirked. "Small stuff doesn't count, buddy. What we have in our bags, it's a whole different story." In that case, I'm with you, Winky. Sanders looked around nervously. To be honest, I don't want to meet with the sheriff. And you guys, are you with us? Condor, what do you say? Banks chewed on a twig and kept silent. His nose, resembling a condor's beak, gloomily loomed over his thin lips. And you, Jack? Jack remembered Hilderman's gaze, intent, assessing, and mocking, like a gambler betting on cockroach races. No, it's just my imagination. You know Scamp Winky, Jack told himself. He's just trying to take everything for himself, and blaming the sheriff. And you don't mess with Hilderman. If we run together, Winky said. Hilderman can't know where we're going. And where are we going? Banks finally spoke. We'll talk on the way, gentlemen, Winky said. Time is running out. They rode on. Jack shifted his revolver closer to his hand. I see you've thought it through, Scamp, Banks finally said. Go ahead. Speak up, it's time. Because I don't know how we can get away. The sheriff isn't stupid. Hilderman has eyes everywhere. How do you plan to slip away with his gold? Our gold, buddy. Our gold, Winky corrected. We have it, and we earned it. It's our gold, every last pound of it. So you knew all along? Kitch was surprised. You knew the sheriff wanted to kill us? Of course, because I'm not used to such gifts. We were offered a quarter of the haul, a huge chunk, too generous to be honest, and too generous for such a scumbag like Hilderman. That's how they do it, to make you lose your mind from greed. Then why did you agree? Because I know what we should do. And what? Jack asked, gesturing. There's the mountains, impassable for horses. The sheriff's waiting there, his town's there. And over that way, Comanche territory. We won't last a day there. Where to, Winky? We'll go to Arizona through Bone Canyon. Sanders pulled the reins and stopped. Banks stopped chewing. You're crazy, Jack asked. No, I've figured it out. No one will expect us to go there. No one will chase us there. We'll gain time and get away with the gold. Even the Indians don't go there. Many have gone through the canyon and nothing happened to them. Do you believe in Indian tales, Jack? I believe that rumors don't come from nowhere. We have plenty of gold and plenty of bullets. What do we have to fear? People went through the canyon during the day, Kitch said uncertainly. It's almost evening, and we'll have to travel at night. And at night. Haven't you heard what happened to the trader from Prestonville when he got delayed and went through Bone Canyon at night? Come on, Winky dismissed. He was killed by the Comanche. The canyon is sacred to them or something. They say his body was torn to pieces. Predatory beasts, that's all. And I agree, Condor said, lighting a cigarette. I'll go through the canyon. Winky figured it out right. If we go at night, by morning we'll be in Arizona, and Hilderman will lose our trail. He'll be the last to look for us there. Excellent. Jack, are you with us? Well, whatever it is, I know nothing that can withstand bullets. And we have plenty of those. One night, and we're across the state line. I'm with you. I don't like this. Kitch Sanders turned his horse around. I'll head west. Banks raised his Winchester. No, you're coming with us, boy, or... Kitch drew his Colt. You think you can scare me? Let's see who shoots faster. If you shoot, I'll plug you myself, Scamp promised. Jack didn't notice when he managed to draw his revolver. You can't take on two of us. Jack stayed silent, waiting for the outcome. Knowing how fast Kitch could shoot, he wouldn't bet even on two opponents and prepared to dive behind his horse. And then we'll see. If the sheriff's men catch you, Winky said with a smile, he'll know where we went. That's why we need to stick together. It's part of my plan. If you don't mind. Think. 4 of us have a better chance of getting through the canyon, whatever's there. If there's anything at all besides sand and rocks. Fine, damn you all. Sanders looked at Banks with resentment and holstered his Colt. Let's go. That's better. Winky spurred his horse. Forward, gentlemen. Hilderman checked his watch for the umpteenth time. He and his men stood in a hollow near the town, waiting. They should have shown up by now. Did they fail and the guards killed them? But then we would have seen the stagecoach. Or did those nooses feel something? The sheriff snapped the cover of his pocket watch shut and put it back in his vest pocket. Well, Benson, do you see anything? He asked again. No, boss, no one, replied his deputy, perched in a tree. Hilderman clenched his teeth. Did they deceive me? Fine. I'll show you how to play with me. The sound of hooves echoed, and one of the scouts rode into the hollow. Following him was a skinny old man, ugly and hook-nosed, dressed in worn-out Indian clothes. Mister, we found an Indian. I know him, someone said. A day laborer and beggar. The Comanche threw him out of the tribe. Now he lives in the desert. Why did you bring this piece of crap here? Hilderman looked at the old man with disdain. He came to hire himself to Miles, and says he saw 4 riders, mister. But I don't know the Comanche language well enough to understand everything he's babbling. Really? Benson, come down. Ask where he saw them? Hilderman pushed his hat back and stepped toward the old man. Tell him I'll give $1 if he tells exactly everything as it was. Benson spoke to the old man. After a few phrases, the deputy turned to the boss. His face was confused. He said, all 4 went to Bone Canyon. Hilderman's men exchanged glances. The damn Indian is lying. And if he's not? It's a cursed place, someone muttered. They're dead men if they went there. Shut up, all of you, the sheriff barked. So they all survived? Ask when he saw them? He says just recently. Well, well, these bastards think I won't get them there. They were wrong. The sun is setting, boys, the sheriff said. Time is short. If we hurry, we'll catch them before dark. Mount up. The Indian spoke, pointing towards the mountains. What is he babbling about? Hilderman asked, climbing into the saddle. He says, don't go after them. They're already dead men, Benson said. Then that saves us the trouble, the sheriff smirked. Though I wanted to personally hang some of them. The old man babbled again, waving his bony hands. His fingers, like bird claws, struck his skinny chest as if trying to reach his heart. He says, don't follow them. Benson translated. Everyone who enters the canyon will die. The werewolf will rip our hearts out. What's a werewolf? Someone asked. Enough listening to Indian tales, the sheriff snapped. My gold is there. Mount up. The old man watched the departing riders. His face, like carved from red stone, remained impassive. He whispered something and trudged back to town. We've arrived, Winky said. The riders stopped their horses. The entrance to the canyon was narrow and in the light of the setting sun looked like the gates of hell. Red, blood-colored rocks in the passage. A black, impenetrable triangular hole. In the yellow sand nearby stood piles of rocks, in the center of which rose totems, crude, painted wooden idols with heaps of bones around them. The coyotes must be fat here, Banks noted. The Comanche don't go further, Sanders said, looking around. And they're no cowards. Have you ever seen a cowardly Comanche? I see only a cowardly white man, Condor said contemptuously. Let's move quickly. I bet Hilderman has already figured it out. Riding into the canyon on horseback was impossible. The rider risked smashing his head against the low stone ceiling. Winky dismounted first and resolutely stepped into the darkness, leading his horse by the reins. Go ahead, Kitch, Condor said. You're next. Why? Figure it out yourself. They froze, staring at each other. I'm not turning my back on you, Condor, Kitch said, clenching his jaw. You go first. No, you go. Spitting out the straw, Banks stepped toward him. Kitch clenched his fists. Jack reached out and grabbed his shoulder. Enough, boys. Go ahead, Kitch, and I'll walk between you. At first narrow, the passage gradually widened, and soon Jack saw the sky. Blue, dotted with bright stars. Night was approaching. Winky waited nearby. A cigarette smoldered in his strong teeth. Here we are, he said, exhaling smoke. We can mount up. Jack climbed into the saddle with relief. He felt more confident there. The sound of hooves echoed off the canyon walls. Why do the Indians fear this place? Banks broke the silence, looking at the sheer canyon walls. Right after the narrow passage, the rocks widened, revealing the canyon. Ancient, time-worn basalt walls rose 100 feet, looming darkly over the travelers' heads. Indian tales, Winky said. Someone shot someone. The coyotes gnawed the bones, and they say a monster lives here, an unseen beast. What kind of beast? Sanders asked. What have you heard? Tell us. The Indians call it the werewolf. It means man-wolf. Is that even possible? Kitch was surprised. See, even you figured it out yourself. Winky smirked. When do you think the sheriff will figure out where we went? I think he already knows, Jack said. He caught Scamp's mockery and feared that hot-tempered Kitch might start a shootout over nothing. But in this place, Sanders was uneasy. He bit his lip and looked around. Then another question. Winky turned to his comrades. Do you think he'll follow our trail? Will he venture here? Condor lifted his hat and scratched his head. I think he will. He's not alone, after all. He's got a bunch of damn deputies, and all with guns. And I hope not. Jack looked back. Don't you feel like someone is watching us? I can feel it. Little Jack, that's fear, Scamp smirked. There's nothing here but rocks. As if to confirm his words, stones tumbled somewhere. And you said, No one, Sanders said, peering into the darkness. Banks slowly lowered his Winchester. Sometimes stones fall on their own. It happens in the mountains. We need to hurry. Winky directed his horse forward, but it suddenly balked and neighed, refusing to move. Whiplashes didn't help. Don't beat it. It senses something, Jack said. He drew his revolver and cocked it. There's something out there. They exchanged glances. We have something too, Winky said grimly, dismounting. Get your weapons ready, gentlemen. Let's go and see what's ahead. I'll guard the horses, Sanders said. Banks sneered. Sure, so you can leave us with all the gold. He won't go anywhere, Condor, Winky waved. If he heads back, he'll fall into the sheriff's hands and straight to the noose. Let's go. Stay, Kitch. We'll check and come back. A barely visible path wound between a pile of rocks and scraggly cacti. The moon hanging over the canyon illuminated only part of it, while the path suitable for horses was plunged into darkness. Jack heard a click. Condor cocked the Winchester. Jack didn't believe in monsters and spirits, but the horses were scared of something. So there must be some kind of beast. But what beast can withstand Colts and a Winchester? Not even a bison, he reassured himself, stepping over the wind-worn stones. And if it's the Comanche? They love ambushes. No, the horses wouldn't be afraid of them, and this place is sacred to the Redskins. No, they wouldn't come here. They slowly moved forward. For a moment, Jack thought one of the stones moved. He raised his revolver and almost pulled the trigger. What's there? Winky asked in a low voice. It seemed like it, Jack whispered. There's no one here, Banks said, lowering his rifle. At that moment, a scream pierced the air. It went on and on, then abruptly stopped, and Winky turned to his comrades. Back. It's Sanders. They rushed to the horses, but all they heard was the sound of receding hooves. Damn. They arrived at the spot, and Jack saw a horse lying on its side with its belly ripped open. Its hooves twitched weakly, slipping in the spreading blood and spilled entrails. The other horses were gone. "Kitch!" Winky shouted. "Kitch!" "He left with our share," Banks exclaimed. "I told you. I'll kill him. After him." "Too late, Condor," Jack said. "Stop." "No, I'll get him." "You won't. There he is." Sanders's legs stuck out from behind a rock. The men bent over the body and then straightened up, looking at each other. Jack clutched his throat, nearly vomiting. "Where's his head?" Banks asked in astonishment. "The Indians are afraid to come here," Benson said, looking at the black abyss. "It's dangerous at night, and the sun is setting. We're not Indians, and there are 10 of us," Hilderman interrupted. "Forward." The men lit the torches they had brought, and the group entered the darkness. Inside, the rock was covered with drawings. People, trees, animals resembling bison, birds and snakes, some arrows and signs, eerie masks. "Damn savages," someone whispered. Finally, they emerged outside. "They were here, boss," Benson said, illuminating the ground with his torch. "Here are the horse tracks." "Then we're on the right track," Hilderman said, laying his carbine across the saddle and tugging the reins. "Forward." "Do you hear that?" Someone stopped. "Someone's riding!" Another man raised his hand. "Prepare," the sheriff commanded. Everyone raised their guns, but from the inky darkness, 3 frenzied, riderless horses burst forth. "Catch them!" Someone screamed, thrown against the rocks, but they managed to corner and stop the horses. "Meister Hilderman, the gold is here," Benson said, opening a saddlebag. They drove the horses away, even left the gold. "That's not all," the sheriff said, inspecting the bags. "If these guys think they bought me off, they're wrong. Benson, take someone and bring the gold to town. The rest of us," he turned to the others, "will find and finish off these hangmen." "What could it be?" Jack asked, looking at his companions. "What could rip a horse like that?" "And take Sanders' head," Condor added, anxiously moving the Winchester barrel around. "Kit shot faster than you," Winky added, "but he didn't get a chance to shoot." "What should we do?" Jack asked. He felt trapped. Going forward was terrifying, but going back was not an option. "We take the gold and move forward. The canyon isn't that long, a few miles." They entered the shadow. Jack's palms were sweaty, his finger frozen on the trigger. He didn't doubt his comrades. None of them were cowards, but he saw fear in their eyes. Could the Indians be right and some unknown beast lives here? But if that's the case, can't we kill it? "Shh, do you hear that?" Winky stopped. "Where?" Condor asked, and at that moment something knocked him down. Winky fired. Jack did too. It was the fastest he'd ever reacted, and he heard the bullet hit something solid. Did he hit it? A black shadow darted aside and disappeared behind the rocks. Jack heard a strange, dull, rhythmic sound like blacksmith bellows being pumped somewhere. "Condor, are you alive?" Banks was getting up from the ground. "The gold saved me," he said, stunned. The bag of gold dust was slashed as if with a razor. Gold grain spilled to the ground, mixing with the dust. "Damn it." Winky fell to his knees and pulled off his hat, scooping gold into it. "Do we have any other bags?" "We've got nothing left," Jack said. "The horses ran off." "I got lucky," Banks said, looking at his friends. "I didn't even see it. If it weren't for the bag, it would have gutted me." "What did you see?" Jack asked. "I don't know." Condor shook his head. "I know one thing. If it weren't for the sheriff, I'd get out of here as fast as I could." "Is there anything to pour it into?" Winky asked irritably. "No," Banks said. "Might as well stuff it in our pockets. Scamp. That thing could attack again." "Put it in the remaining bag," Jack said. He bent down and helped Winky. Condor stood over them with the Winchester in his hands. "The bag won't hold," he said, listening to the darkness. "It will. We'll take turns carrying it. I'll go first," he said, struggling to lift the bag onto his shoulder. "Let's go." "Wait," Condor said, looking around. "We need to think this through. Without horses, we won't get far. We need to find shelter." "The sheriff will be here soon," Winky reminded. "We need to hurry." "I hit it?" Jack suddenly said. "Are you sure?" Scamp turned to his companion. "Sure. Only the bullet bounced off it like a safe, or it seemed to me." "At least you hit it?" "I emptied the whole drum and can't boast the same." Winky spoke with difficulty. The bag was heavy. "You know what? I think Condor is right. We need to find shelter. There are plenty of cracks and caves in these rocks. We'll find something and hide until the moon lights up the canyon. In the dark, we're doomed." "You suggest we trap ourselves?" Condor said. "It's easier to keep an eye on a single entrance than stand in the open for the beast to see us when we can't see it." Jack admitted Winky was right. "And the sheriff?" Banks asked. "We haven't heard from him yet, have we?" "This is a bad place, boss. Everyone knows it. We found the gold. No need to go further," said a bearded giant with a rifle. "No, we're going after them." "What are you afraid of, Bob?" Hilderman stopped his horse. "I thought you weren't a coward." "They say no one leaves here alive at night," one of the men said. "Bone Canyon is a cursed place." Hilderman looked at his tense men. "Indian tales. Will you believe them or believe me?" "I promise their share will be yours," he said. "Understand what I'm saying, gentlemen?" "Well, if that's the case." Bob raised his rifle. It seemed like a twig in his huge hand. "Let's catch them, boys." 6 men rode silently over the rocky scree. "Look here!" someone shouted. "A horse! Dead! And no gold! And Kitch Sanders! God rest his soul!" "How do you know it's him? There's no head. He won those pants from me in poker." "That damn cheat." "One got his share," Hilderman spat on the rocks. "We'll find the others." "What could have torn his head off, boss?" Kruger, a frail old man in a colorful frock coat and with an ancient rifle taller than him, asked. "Some beast. Or maybe Winky shot it off. What does it matter? There are only 3 of them left. Let's go." "The trail is almost invisible. The horses will break their legs," someone said. "Then you'll go first and lead the horse," the sheriff barked. "Light the torches. We can't see a damn thing." "Seems like a good spot," Jack said. A narrow crack led deep into the rock, gradually narrowing. 3 men could fit inside, and all 3 sat facing the entrance, their hands never leaving their weapons. "What do you think this creature is?" Jack turned to Banks. "I don't know, but it's very fast, like it has wings." "Could it be wolves?" "You're an idiot, Condor. Wolves don't attack people like that. They kill differently, though there are some similarities." "It's a huge wolf," Banks said, ignoring the mockery. "A huge wolf would have bigger prey. A ground squirrel or a snake wouldn't be enough for it." They fell silent. "What did you say about the werewolf?" Jack asked. "Do you think it exists?" "I know something tore Kitch's head off, and it's not a lion, crocodile, or bison." "Quiet, Condor. You're shouting loud enough to be heard in Arizona." "The moon is rising," Winky said. "Look, the canyon is getting brighter." "So what? How does that help us?" Jack asked. "I think this creature doesn't like the light. It attacked in the dark, did you notice? Jack nodded. If we move through the lit areas, we can make it out. At least we'll be able to see it and shoot it. Look, the moon will be here soon. Enough resting, we need to move. Indeed, the darkness retreated to the canyon walls, revealing a bone-littered clearing. Jesus, Condor exclaimed, peeking out of the shelter. What is this? A lair, that's all, Winky said. He stood nearby, not letting go of his Colt. Jack noticed how his fingers moved, stroking the ribbed grip of the pistol. It devoured them all. It or they, Winky corrected. Why not coyotes? Condor asked. Did you hear a single one here? Jack nodded. In the canyon, he hadn't heard these predators all night, though they were plentiful in the surrounding wastelands, and at night they howled like a damned orchestra. Do you think there might be many? Banks looked into Scamp's face. No animal lives forever, and Indian legends are much older. Damn, you're right, Banks said. Indians are crafty, but they can't lie. Ah. A horrific scream interrupted their conversation. Scamp pressed himself against the wall. Jack joined them. Don't go, Condor shouted softly, grabbing Winky by the shirt. He brushed him off and peeked outside. Come here, quickly. Jack and Condor stood next to him. Look, the half-breed's finger pointed up. Jack squinted. People stood at the canyon's edge. The full moon's light revealed their white pants, feathered heads, and tattooed skin. Comanche, Condor muttered. Redskin bastards. Look. Only now did Jack see the tiny platform hanging over the abyss. The Indians pushed a man onto it. Spears prodded him, forcing him to move. Condor raised his Winchester. Winky grabbed the barrel, lowering it to the ground. You'll give us away. And he's doomed anyway. The prisoner swayed. The scream of a falling man cut through the silence, followed by a horrific splat on the rocks. They're sacrificing him, Jack whispered. Yes, feeding the spawn of hell, Banks said, looking around the canyon. The Comanche are gone, Winky said. We need to leave before those creatures come. They quickly crossed the shadow, reaching the moonlit clearing. Bones lay everywhere. There were bull and smaller animal skeletons, human bones with remnants of clothing on the gnawed remains. I know this guy, Jack said, stopping by a corpse. That's Benson, the sheriff's deputy. Look, our gold is here too. Familiar bags lay next to the bodies of the executed. They had burst from the impact, and the moonlight played on the rocks covered in gold dust. How did the gold get here? Banks asked. The sheriff found our horses and sent the gold to town, and the Comanche were right there, Jack suggested. So, the sheriff is coming after us. Did you doubt it? Winky smiled wickedly. Jack looked at his companions. Let's get out of here. Dawn is far off. Stick to the light side. They were here. The tracker's torch illuminated the crevice. Here are the tracks, and someone's cigarette butt. To hell with the cigarette butt. Hilderman surveyed the cave walls. They couldn't have hidden in there? Looks like a dead end. The man with the torch went a little further. There's nothing here? Boss, the horses! Someone shouted from outside. Hilderman rushed out of the cave and saw Bob struggling to hold a snorting, wild-eyed horse. Someone ran to help him. Old Kruger clutched his rifle in confusion. His horse had broken free and bolted. They've gone mad. They sensed something, boss, Bob shouted. This is bad. Get your guns ready. Hilderman cocked his rifle. Keep your eyes open. Can't see anything. It's dark. You have torches. How many horses are left? Only 2, boss. I've never seen horses so scared, Kruger said. My mare was always calm. Shut up, I hear something, the sheriff interrupted. Do you hear it? They heard a faint rhythmic sound. "What is that?" one of the men asked and then screamed, soaring into the air. The hunters raised their rifles, but no one knew where to shoot. The man's scream was cut short as his body slammed into the rocks. "There's something here." A man's voice trembled with terror. "In the dark." "Hold the torches higher," the sheriff ordered. "Look around." "We need to run," one of the men shouted. "Let's get out of here." He bolted down the path. In the torchlight, Hilderman saw a long, black shape dart after the man. The fleeing man squealed like a pig under the knife. Hilderman grabbed Bob's torch and flung it forward. The black creature, almost blending with the darkness, hissed, spreading enormous wings. "Shoot!" The command was drowned out by gunfire. The flashes lit up the hunters' contorted faces. They fired everything in their barrels and cylinders at the creature. It flapped, screamed, leaped, and disappeared behind the rocks. "Let's go see." Raising the torch, Hilderman moved forward. "Be ready." "We're not going, boss. We need to get out of here," Kruger said, huddling in fear. "I'm not going any further." "You will." Hilderman aimed his Winchester at him. "I pay you, and you will go." "No, boss. We've had enough." The giant Bob grabbed the sheriff's gun, forcing the barrel to the ground, and Hilderman realized there was no point in fighting. "I said, we're not going further." The sheriff looked at the third man. "Fine, cowards," he snarled. "Leave. You won't get $1, but when I get back—" "Sheriff, come with us," Bob said placatingly. "Those guys are surely dead, and these creatures will kill us if we don't get out of here." "I'm not leaving," the sheriff cut him off. "I need Winky, and I'll get him. I'll pay each of you 50 on top of your share." "To hell with the money," Bob muttered, mounting his horse. Kruger climbed onto the second horse behind the rider, and they rode off. 100. The riders disappeared into the darkness. The sound of hooves faded, and it became quiet, with only the cicadas chirping piercingly somewhere in the distance. "Bastards," the sheriff muttered. He unfastened his holster to draw his Colt more easily, looked at the smirking moon, and slowly walked forward. "Stop!" Winky raised his hand. Jack and Condor heard gunshots. "They're shouting? Do you hear?" "It's over there." "It's the sheriff." Jack looked around at his companions. Everything fell silent. "Looks like the sheriff has other concerns now," Winky smirked. "Well?" Condor brightened up. "Maybe the creatures killed them all? What difference does it make? They'll come after us next." "No, wait." Banks got agitated. "If the sheriff is done for, there's no reason for us to risk it. Let's find shelter and wait out the night. Those creatures are probably asleep during the day. We'll wait out the night and calmly leave the canyon." "He's right," Jack said. "Winky, he's making sense." "All right, let's find shelter. Keep your eyes open." The moonlight bathed the left side of the canyon, and every shadow seemed fraught with danger. Jack tried to step quietly, but in the tense silence, every step sounded like a landslide. The right side of the canyon was shrouded in darkness, but even in that darkness, eyes could detect movement. Something was moving there, rustling, slicing through the air. "Look up!" Banks cried hoarsely. Jack looked up and saw a black stone detach from the canyon's edge and fall down towards the mutilated bodies of the captives. Moments later, an enormous figure of the werewolf emerged from the stone, and the monstrous creature descended next to the bodies. The fugitives crouched in unison. "Don't shoot," Winky mouthed. "It's the werewolf." The creature bent over the remains, and the muffled sound of chewing reached the fugitives. It was devouring them, accepting the sacrifice. In the moonlight, the men saw its glossy black fur and flat head, resembling that of a wolf. Two powerful claws gathered behind the creature's back, and its long tail ended in a tuft. But the monster wasn't just a beast. It was half wolf, half human. The Indians knew this creature had lived here all along, Jack thought, and we didn't believe them. "I can take it down," Banks said. The barrel of his Winchester followed the monster's movements. "Don't even think about it." Scamp grabbed his sleeve. "We better get out of here fast." The creature shuddered and hissed. Its head turned. It smelled us. Winky, ducking, ran away. "Run!" Jack bolted. Banks ran last. Behind him, Jack heard the creature's voice. A terrifying, guttural roar, unlike anything he had ever heard. "This way!" Winky shouted. "There's a cave!" They ran under the stone arch. Banks stopped and fired. The creature screeched. "Hit! Condor!" Jack shouted. "This way!" But it was too late. The werewolf's head appeared in the opening. The toothy maw grabbed Banks by the side. Condor screamed, trying to fend it off with the butt of his rifle, but the creature quickly dragged him outside. Winky raised his revolver but couldn't shoot, fearing to hit his comrade. Banks' scream was cut short. Jack and Winky exchanged glances. The half-breed was pale, and now Jack saw that he regretted his choice. Yes, it was easier to fend off the Comanche. "Do you think he's dead, Jack?" "Of course." Jack checked his bullets. "Not many left. If one bullet is enough for a man, it won't stop a monster." "Got any water?" Winky asked. Jack unhooked his canteen from his belt and handed it to him. Scamp took a gulp. "Too bad it's not whiskey," he smirked. "Right, Jack? Do you think it left?" "Let's check." Jack approached the entrance and barely managed to step back. An ugly head on a long, fur-covered neck squeezed into the crevice, smelled the prey, and lunged, opening its toothy maw. Jack jumped back and fired. The bullet pierced the monster's neck. It screeched, and its death cry drowned out the thunder of the Winchester's discharge. The creature collapsed, twitched in convulsions, and went limp. "We killed it," Jack said, rising. His back, jarred from the fall, ached. But it was better than being bitten by such a maw. "We killed the werewolf. I think we should get out of here." Scamp quickly reloaded his weapon. "Before the relatives of the slain arrive." Jack looked at the creature in horror. It was about 10 feet long. The head resembled a wolf's, but was broad and flat like a suitcase. A bony crest started from the nostrils, running along the creature's back and ending at the base of the tail. The black, spindle-shaped body was covered in thick fur, and the long, flexible tail ended in a tuft. "Look at those claws, Jack." Winky nudged the beast with his foot, and Jack saw a bent paw with claws as long as knives. "So werewolves do exist," the half-breed said. And I didn't believe it. Nobody would believe such a thing. We should have gone through Comanche land. "We'll make it, little Jack." Banks was right. We just need to wait till morning. Moonlight penetrated the shelter. The entrance was well lit, but the back of the cave was engulfed in impenetrable darkness. "I'll take a look around," Jack said. Cocking the Colt's hammer, he took out matches and lit one. The weak, flickering light illuminated the cave walls. It was a natural passage, broken and low, but wide enough for a man to pass. The match burned out. Jack lit another. "What do you see, Jackie?" "I don't know. This passage seems to go deep under the mountain." Jack heard a hiss, dropped the match at his feet, and recoiled. The cave floor was swarming with striped snakes. "Winky, there are a lot of snakes here." Scamp instantly sprang to his feet. "That's bad," he said. "Can't even lie down, get bitten, and you won't get up." They moved closer to the entrance. One of the snakes slithered too close, raised its head, and Winky shot, shattering its skull. "Let's get out of here," he said. "Look up, Jack. I'll take a look around." They exited the cave. At this spot, the canyon was particularly wide, and the moon lit it almost entirely. Clusters of time-worn boulders, pitiful bushes, and a few gnarled cacti adorned the bare canyon floor. Jack saw the skeleton of a wheelless wagon, abandoned by someone here. What happened to its owners could only be guessed. A narrow strip of shadow began nearby, covering the approaches to the cave. If they quickly crossed it, it seemed Winky was thinking the same thing. "The canyon is well lit," he said. "We'll run through the dark part, and then—" Jack nodded. "Okay." "Not so fast, gentlemen," someone said. Winky turned, but didn't have time to shoot. The Winchester roared, and the half-breed flew against the wall and fell. Jack quickly crouched and backed into the cave, praying not to step on a snake. "Who's there?" a voice asked, and Jack recognized Sheriff Hilderman. "Is it you, Banks, or little Jack?" "It's me," Jack said, pressing against the rocks. "And Banks." "I only saw two. You're lying." "Check for yourself." "Ah," said the darkness. "I see what's left of Banks. So you're the last one, Jack. You've got the gold, don't you?" Jack stayed silent. "What now?" "Hilderman knows I'm here alone." "So you tried to trick me and run off with my gold?" The sheriff laughed. "All right, I believe you didn't come up with this. You had no choice, boy, I understand. Come out, Jack, I won't hurt you." Jack didn't believe him. "I'm the last witness. He'll kill me just like he killed Winky. No, I can't come out, but what can I do?" "Don't want to come out? Well, I'll wait till morning. My men will come, and we'll hang you from the nearest tree." Jack's eyes fell on the bags of gold. "If I strap them to my chest, they should stop a bullet. I have to risk it. God help me." "Well, Jack, I'm waiting. Come out, I won't shoot." His legs trembled. Jack cautiously stepped out from behind the rock. He raised his hands. "I'm coming out. Don't shoot." The Winchester roared. Jack felt the bullet hit the bags and push him backward. He cried out and fell. His hand groped for the Colt. A black silhouette emerged from behind the rocks. Hilderman approached. Jack lay still, not moving. "Seems like I'm alive." "Well, that's the last one," the sheriff said. "It's done. Now—" Jack fired. Blood sprayed in a fan as Hilderman's head snapped back, his hat flying off. The sheriff was dead before his body hit the ground. Jack got up. The gold had saved his life. He loosened the belt and let the heavy bags drop to the ground. It was over. He knelt beside Winky and saw that the half-breed was dead. Jack sat on a rock, leaning against the stone wall. "They're all dead, and I'm alive." He laughed, then bent over the dead and gathered all the ammunition he could find. He didn't take the rifles, considering them too heavy. There was still gold to carry. The sky was lightening, and the stars were fading, heralding the arrival of morning. The shadows turned from black to blue. He could now see every pebble and every protrusion on the sheer red and yellow-streaked rock face. Jack walked along the canyon wall, keeping his revolvers ready, until the mountain receded, and he saw an opening. This was Arizona. No water, no horse, and no friends. But he had made it. Jack laughed, but the laughter turned into a cough from his parched throat. The heavy bags had chafed his shoulders, his legs throbbed with fatigue, and he was desperately thirsty. No matter. There had to be a road somewhere nearby, and from there he could get to a town. Little Creek was about 10 miles away, he figured. He could make it on foot. And then, the heavy bags filled with gold dust would last him a long time. He could go anywhere. Buy a ranch. Get married. The day was breaking and the canyon was widening, revealing the yellow-green prairie, hills, and huge cacti. I made it. Winky was right. You can get through Bone Canyon. At least I could. Jack imagined telling his story in a crowded, awestruck saloon, of course leaving out certain details, and felt like a hero. If I can just make it to town, then I'll come back with horses and pick up the remaining gold. No one knows about it, no one. They're all dead. And the werewolf isn't a threat during the day. I'm rich, and I'll become even richer. Jack stopped. The bags fell to the sand. It was too late to shoot. Riders emerged from behind the rocks, and he recognized the Comanche. The Indians slowly blocked the pass. He looked at them, expecting a war cry and gunshots, but the Redskins were silent. They didn't attack, and Jack understood what it meant. They wouldn't let him out of the canyon. He was the werewolf's prey. Jack laughed and turned his back to the Indians. The bags of gold remained on the sand. Bone Canyon was waiting. "I'll make it," he muttered. "There's still a long time until nightfall."
Story 2.
One thing that can abruptly pull you out of your daily routine and compel you to travel to another city is the notification that your recently deceased uncle has left you a house in his will. Naturally, you must urgently appear at a specified address to claim your inheritance. Standing on the porch, my father and I read the letter, and the next day, we set off in my father's old pickup truck, heading to an unknown town in the Midwest. It was the height of summer, with the relentless sun causing the asphalt to melt from the heat. Along the road were green fields, periodically interspersed with small woods and farmlands. My father, behind the wheel, seemed lost in thought, occasionally asking me if we were on the right track. Tired of repeating that the navigator would tell us where to turn, I reassured him. He was an old-school man, 60 years old, but still fit, with short hair partially covered in gray and a small beard. My father resembled the image of a typical forester, as if he had stepped right out of an old book or classic movie. Picture a man in suspenders, a cozy hat on his head, firmly holding a huge axe. His figure radiated strength and confidence, characteristic of those accustomed to living and working among endless forests. There was always a spark of joy in his eyes, and his laughter was loud and infectious, filling the air with liveliness and warmth. When he laughed, he sometimes jokingly pounded his chest, as if to emphasize his vigor and spirited nature. My father had owned a butcher shop for about 25 years. Since we had to leave suddenly, he left it in the care of his assistant, Darryl, whom he seemed to distrust, grumbling all the way that he wanted to finish this business and return as soon as possible. I sat next to him, typing an article on my laptop that I needed to submit today. I worked as a reporter, or more precisely, a budding reporter, in my town. I wasn't entrusted with anything important, just minor articles like Mrs. Norris received the Best Gardener Award in the county, and the like. I was finishing a piece about a local dog breeder who had a record dozen puppies. Trying to concentrate, I was still pondering the words of our chief editor, Miss Campbell. "You need to go to another city? Fine. But don't come back without a good story." These words slightly unsettled me. What could I possibly write about? The voice of the navigator interrupted my thoughts. "Please turn left in half a mile." Ahead was a turn leading into forested, mountainous terrain. After a few more miles, the road became more winding, and the scenery more picturesque. Small houses and farms appeared more frequently, and the air smelled of freshly baked bread and barbecue. Soon, we entered the town, its remarkable authenticity striking me first. It was like stepping into another era. The streets were paved with cobblestones, and the houses along them seemed old but well maintained. Many were built in Victorian style, with elegant balconies and lacy spirals on the roofs. We passed a small town park where children played by a fountain and elders sat on benches, exchanging news and gossip. Father nodded towards them, as if affirming his thoughts on the local community. The main street was decorated with colorful flags and garlands, as if the town was preparing for a festival or celebration. I noticed several shops that seemed unchanged since their inception. An old pharmacy, a bookstore with windows filled with antique books, and a cozy confectionery with the aroma of freshly baked pie wafting onto the street. Along with all this, I saw the local church, perched on a high hill, with stained glass windows sparkling in the sun. Its ancient bell rang occasionally, adding a special charm to the atmosphere. Finally, the navigator led us to one of the most noticeable buildings in the town. It was made of terracotta-colored brick, with slender arched windows and intricate wrought iron patterns decorating the facade and balconies. The entrance to the building was through old double wooden doors with carved patterns and a large brass knocker. Above the door was an elegant sign with the name of Mr. Williams' law firm done in a classic style. We parked at the entrance, admiring the beauty, and entered the building. The interior of the building was no less impressive. The lobby welcomed us with dark wooden panels and polished parquet flooring. The walls were adorned with portraits of past owners and notable city figures, as well as antique paintings and engravings. The high ceilings and wide staircases with carved banisters added a sense of grandeur to the interior. Meister Williams' office comprised several private offices and meeting rooms, each retaining a historical style and elegance. Soft lighting, heavy curtains on the windows, and solid furniture created an atmosphere of the past century, both comfortable and commanding respect. Each room housed large leather chairs and oak tables, and shelves filled with antique books and artifacts. We approached the reception where a secretary sat. After introducing ourselves, she nodded, made a call, and then led us to the office. We were greeted by an elderly man with graying temples and a penetrating gaze behind thick-framed glasses. He was dressed sharply and elegantly in a classic suit and tie. Neat stacks of documents lay on his desk, along with a nameplate reading, Attorney Williams. He waved us to sit down. "Mr. Morgan, I hope you had a safe journey. Our town is a bit out of the way and we rarely have visitors," he said, adjusting his glasses. "No, sir. Everything was fine. The town is actually great," my father replied. "I'm glad you like it. And this is your son, Alex?" "Yes," I answered. "Well then, let's get straight to the matter. Your uncle, Robert Harding, who recently left this mortal world, left behind a house and a plot of farmland, about 5 acres in total. As he had no other relatives besides you, he bequeathed everything to you. You can take possession of this inheritance, but there is one condition." "A condition? What kind of condition?" "There was nothing about that in the letter," my father asked loudly. "Yes, sir, I didn't write about it, but it's quite simple. You just need to live in the house for a week." "Is that all?" my father asked. Then, after some thought, looked at me and continued, "I guess we'll have to take a short mini-vacation." "Well, that's settled then. Here are the documents you need to sign. Later I will take you to the house. It's also my duty to check on you every day. I'll come by in the mornings." After that, he handed the documents to my father, who, after carefully reading them, signed. We then left the building and headed to the farm. It was located south of the town, about a half-hour drive away, and we arrived at the destination. It was a cornfield with a 2-story house in the center. A gravel driveway led to it from the north. The building itself was done in a traditional rural style. Outside, it was covered with wooden panels, painted in a warm, muted color. The roof had either tiles or metal sheets, adding durability and practicality to the building. Around the house was a cozy porch, where you could spend warm summer evenings enjoying the views of the fields. Next to the house stood a tall beech tree, partly overhanging it. As we got out of the car and looked around, Mr. Williams handed us the keys, saying that the count would start the next morning, and he would arrive here at exactly 8, so he asked us not to leave at that time. Then he said goodbye to us and left. We then began to explore the house. The first floor included a spacious living room, kitchen, dining area, and a bathroom. The interior was done in a cozy country style, with wooden furniture and decorations emphasizing a connection with nature and the land. I liked it. Everything was clean and neat. Then I went up to the second floor. There were bedrooms, with picturesque views of the surrounding lands from the windows. Looking at the surroundings from above, I immersed myself in a feeling of unity with nature and found an incredible sense of peace and tranquility. As it began to darken, my father and I had a snack with the food we had brought, and exhausted after the move, went to sleep. Day 1. This morning the sound of the doorbell woke me up. I got up, rubbed my eyes, and yawned as I went downstairs. It was Mr. Williams. Dad was already standing at the threshold signing something. Then they had a brief talk and Mr. Williams left. I washed my face and we sat down for breakfast. Breakfast was just the leftovers from yesterday's meal. I looked for food in the fridge, but it was already spoiled. We needed to visit the local supermarket. Then Dad and I decided to explore the house. I carefully checked the bedrooms, peeked into the storage room on the second floor, but found nothing of interest. Just as I was about to go downstairs, I heard a shout. Dad was calling me, his voice joyful. He was in his bedroom. When I entered, I saw a typical bedroom with a bed, bedside tables, and a dresser on the side. Behind the dresser was another door, open. I went through it and discovered a hidden room, something like a hunting trophy hall. The room was finished in dark wood, and various hunting trophies hung on the walls. Deer antlers, moose, and bear heads. The soft light from wall sconces created a cozy yet mystical atmosphere. In the center of the room stood a heavy oak table with various hunting accessories, cartridges, gun oils, and antique maps of local forests and fields. But the most notable item in the room was a hunting rifle, neatly placed on a stand. My father, standing nearby, picked it up. It was a Beretta 687 Silver Pigeon III model, known for its quality and high cost. The rifle had an exquisite appearance. The barrel was made of shiny steel, and the stock and forend were crafted from high-quality walnut wood with elegant carvings. Fine engravings on the metal parts depicted scenes of hunting life and nature, adding a special elegance and uniqueness to the rifle. My father stood admiring it. Everyone has their passions, and for my father it was hunting. Since my childhood, he had taken me through forests and mountains, teaching me how to track, gather herbs, shoot, and hunt. He continued inspecting the rifle, and I saw a gleam in his eyes that didn't bode well. Suddenly, he turned to me and said, "Since we've already checked in today and have nothing much to do, why don't we go hunting?" "Stop it. It's too hot to trudge anywhere. Let's just stay at home," I replied. "No, we're going," said my father, starting to pack cartridges and other things into a bag lying nearby. I realized there was no changing his mind. "Fine, but we need to stop by the local supermarket for food on the way." We quickly got ready and loaded everything into our pickup. Dad, always attentive to details, checked that his gun permit and hunting license were in the glove compartment. He always kept them handy. One last look at the house to make sure everything was locked, and we were on our way. The road to the forest went through the entire town, northward, at the foot of the local mountain range. Driving through the center, I noticed a supermarket. We'll have to stop there on the way back, I thought to myself. The town slowly gave way to foothills, and soon, after passing the northern outskirts, we found ourselves on a dirt road leading deep into the forest. The dusty road wound through the trees, inviting us into the mysterious and wild kingdom of nature. The forest enveloped us with its lush greenery and mysterious sounds. Sunbeams pierced through the tree canopies, creating a play of light and shadow on the ground. Dad turned off the engine, and the sudden silence of the forest surrounded us. We got out of the pickup, and Dad immediately started checking his equipment. I followed suit, realizing that from now on, every move and sound we made could determine the success of our hunt. Dad held the very rifle, eager to try it out as soon as possible, while I held a simpler carbine we found in the same room. We headed into the depths of the forest, leaving the pickup behind. We tried to step carefully, avoiding breaking twigs under our feet. Dad led the way, his movements showing confidence and knowledge of the forest. I followed behind, trying not to lag. We passed dense thickets and small clearings where sunbeams created bright oases amid the green sea of the forest. From time to time we stopped, listening to the sounds of nature, searching for signs of game. As we continued through the forest, strangely, game seemed to have vanished. There was no sound of branches cracking under someone's paws, no rustling in the bushes. Everything was unnaturally quiet, and this silence began to fill the air with something ominous. Dad cast puzzled and cautious glances at me. As we moved deeper into the woods, the dense canopy of trees and shrubs made the light dimmer and the shadows thicker. The wind grew colder and the air was filled with a pungent smell, a mix of decay and wild animal. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a huge wolf attacked us. Its eyes burned like coals, and a deep growl echoed from its mouth. It was unusually large, more like a creature from nightmares than a regular wolf. The wolf's silvery fur shimmered in the dim light, its muscles tensed, ready to attack. Dad reacted swiftly, grabbing the rifle. My heart stopped in anticipation. The wolf lunged forward, its massive teeth gleaming, ready to tear our flesh. Dad fired. The loud sound echoed through the forest, but the wolf only sped up its charge. The situation became even more desperate when the beast reached Dad and knocked him down. Shaking with fear and adrenaline, I grabbed my carbine. The wolf turned to me, its eyes flashing with madness. I fired. The bullet hit the wolf in the side, and it howled in pain. The struggle was fierce and chaotic. Despite its wound, the wolf continued to attack ferociously. Eventually, Dad, gathering all his strength, aimed again and fired. This time the bullet found its mark, and the monstrous wolf fell to the ground, issuing one last prolonged howl. Dad and I stood there, breathing heavily, staring at the fallen beast. The air was filled with a mix of gunpowder, blood, and fear. My heart pounded in my ears for a long time, and we were momentarily petrified, stunned by what had just happened. My heart raced wildly in my chest, and Dad's breathing became rapid and uneven. In each other's eyes, we saw reflections of shock and disbelief. The wolf's attack was so sudden and brutal that it felt as if we had faced the very embodiment of wild nature. For a moment I thought about how close we had been to death or serious injury, but fortunately, we were both unharmed. Recovering from the initial shock, we set to work. The wolf's carcass was heavy, and it took considerable effort to load it into the pickup's bed. Dad securely tied the carcass, ensuring it wouldn't slide off during transit. We performed all necessary actions in silence, each of us lost in thoughts about what had just occurred. Leaving the forest, we headed back to town. The ride was quiet, as if we both were still unable to fully comprehend what had happened. The forest, which had previously seemed a place of mystery and excitement, now left us with a feeling of anxiety and horror. On the way back, we stopped at the supermarket I had noticed earlier. After stocking up on groceries, Dad and I came out of the store to find our acquaintance, Mr. Williams, standing next to our pickup, apparently waiting for us. "I see you're getting settled in. I was just passing by," he said with a smile. But then he saw our faces and asked with concern, "Did something happen?" We told him about our hunting trip and the attack. Mr. Williams listened silently at first, but when we described what happened with the wolf, his face changed, and he rushed to the pickup, pulling back the tarp to stare at the wolf's carcass. His face transformed unrecognizably, a mix of shock, fear, and anxiety. He stood there for a long time, statue-like. Dad, with a concerned, "Sir, are you all right?" pulled him back to reality. Williams, looking around anxiously, covered the tarp again. Then, without looking us in the eye, he said goodbye, citing urgent matters, and hurried away. I had a feeling that we were somehow outcasts, as if he wanted to get rid of us as quickly as possible. Dad and I exchanged puzzled glances. Then we got into the pickup and drove home. At home, we stored the carcass in a large refrigerator, typical for serious hunters, and after dinner, went to bed. It was a tough day. Falling asleep was hard. The day's events kept replaying in my mind: the wolf attack, the lawyer's strange behavior. But gradually, I drifted off to sleep. Day 2. This morning I woke up late. My body felt as heavy as if filled with lead. I got up, washed up, and started preparing breakfast. Dad was already busy around the yard. Then he joined me. He told me that Mr. Williams had come by in the morning and had again behaved strangely, not making eye contact, quickly getting a signature, and then driving off in his car. Dad asked him what was happening, but he didn't answer. It was very strange. We speculated that maybe the wolf we had shot was a local attraction or some kind of deity in their beliefs. But it wasn't wise to talk to the locals, especially asking about the wolf, and the lawyer refused to explain. Sighing, we finished breakfast and started thinking about what to do. Dad suggested cleaning the house. I agreed. Manual labor is the best way to calm anxious thoughts. We looked for cleaning supplies, found an old vacuum cleaner, a couple of old rags, and almost finished powder. We needed to go to the store for cleaning supplies. Dad started up his old pickup, and 20 minutes later, we were already approaching the town. As we entered the town, I immediately felt that something was wrong. The morning was quiet, the streets seemed deserted, but there was an unpleasant tension in the air. As we slowly made our way down the main street towards the store, I began to notice that people on the street stopped and stared at us. Their gazes were fixed and intense, as if they were seeing something unknown and troubling. None of them smiled, their faces devoid of any emotion, their eyes reflecting nothing but a cold, incomprehensible interest. As we drove past a cafe, I noticed people sitting at the tables silently turn to us, their eyes following our pickup until we were out of sight. There was no usual buzz of conversations or ringing laughter, just a grim and heavy silence. Even the children on the street stopped playing and stood staring at us as we slowly passed. Their toys hung motionless in their hands, and there was no usual childlike joy or curiosity on their faces. When we parked at the store, I looked at Dad, and in his eyes, I saw a reflection of my own unease. We got out of the car, and suddenly it seemed like the sounds of the city died down, as if the whole street had frozen in anticipation of our next move. We entered the store for cleaning supplies, feeling piercing gazes on us. These stares seemed to follow us, leaving the impression that we had fallen into some strange, unreal trap, where every step we took was watched with unprecedented caution and unknown intentions. After purchasing what we needed, we paid, and the cashier didn't look us in the eyes, her behavior indicating she wanted to get rid of us as soon as possible. We got back into the pickup and headed home, Dad glancing around anxiously, muttering, "What the hell is going on here?" As we drove down the street, a couple of men walked past and stared at us. Dad, impulsive as he was, couldn't take it anymore, slammed on the brakes, jumped out of the car, ran up to them, and grabbed one by the collar, shouting, "What's your problem?" The men were scared, as if afraid of someone contagious or leprous. The man Dad was holding broke free, and they ran away as fast as they could. Dad just stood there with his mouth open. Then, getting back into the car and muttering about the strange damn town, he drove home. When we got back, Dad tried to call the lawyer, but his phone was off. The desire to clean was completely gone. We sat in silence, trying to figure out what was happening. I searched the internet but found nothing unusual. All that was known about this town were dry facts, like it was founded in 1837 and how many people lived there. So went the day, me sitting at my laptop and Dad watching TV. In the evening after dinner, we were about to go to bed when we suddenly heard a loud noise from the barn behind the house. The sound was so unexpected and loud that we both jolted and exchanged looks of growing apprehension. Glancing out the window, we saw that the evening had shrouded the yard in darkness. Dad nodded towards the barn, and without wasting time, we got up from the table. He took a flashlight, and we headed to the barn, feeling the tension build with every step. Approaching the barn, we noticed the door was slightly ajar, though we distinctly remembered closing it. The air was permeated with a strange, barely perceptible smell, a mix of metal and something rotten. Dad cautiously pushed the door, and its hinges' creak cut through the silence like a harbinger of something ominous. Inside, the barn was in chaos. Boxes were overturned, old garden tools lay scattered on the floor, and bags of fertilizer were torn open. It seemed as if someone had been searching for something amid this disorder, turning everything upside down. We slowly made our way through the chaos, Dad's flashlight illuminating new details of the mess. The darkness in the corners of the barn seemed impenetrable, and every time the light fell on something unexpected, my heart skipped a beat in fear. Suddenly, something stirred in the corner, making both of us flinch. Dad directed the flashlight there, but there was no one. Just an old rag that had apparently fallen off a shelf. We inspected every corner but found no signs of who or what might have caused this disorder. Returning to the house, we felt a deep unease and uncertainty. Something was happening here. This house and this town were very strange. Dad decided to call the police, but when they found out who was calling, they refused to come, saying it was probably just a wild raccoon that had gotten into our barn. Their response made us even more worried because if anything happened, the police wouldn't come to us. We talked a bit more with Dad and decided that in the morning we had to corner the lawyer and find out what the hell was going on. Day 3. The next day we got up at 6 a.m., as the lawyer was supposed to come by 8. We decided to investigate the barn first, following the previous day's chaos. Upon inspecting it, we discovered tracks that might have belonged to a dog or a wolf. They were too large for a raccoon. The tracks were around the barn, as if the animal was looking for a way to get inside. Studying them, we figured out they led to the field. So these creatures came from the field. We tidied up the barn and concluded that maybe we had been worrying unnecessarily, and it was indeed wild animals that caused the commotion. Closer to 8, we sat on the porch, waiting for the lawyer, but he didn't show up. At exactly 8, Dad received a message. It was from Mr. Williams, saying he couldn't come but knew we were at the farm and would mark the third day as completed. Dad was infuriated by the message and, grabbing the keys, started up the pickup. I followed him. Half an hour later, we were standing in front of the lawyer's building. To our surprise, it was closed. We tried the door handle, but it was locked. With no other option, we had to leave empty-handed. As we drove there, people stared at us again, but this time they hurriedly fled if we got close. This behavior was truly frightening. It was like those internet pranks where everyone in an elevator stares at one person, causing them to feel extreme discomfort, looking around themselves, checking if they are okay. The same thing was happening to us. Near the building, a couple of kids about 5 years old were playing. I decided to approach them and ask questions, as children are naturally more trusting. But when I approached, they screamed loudly and ran away crying. "Damn, what is happening here?" my father cursed. We got back into the pickup and returned to the farm. When we arrived, Dad went up to his bedroom and came back with a trap in his hands. He set it up near the barn in case the animal returned. As lunchtime approached, we took the table out to the porch and decided to have lunch outside. The heat was unbearable, and there was not even the slightest breeze in the air. My gaze involuntarily slid over the golden sea of the cornfield stretching out in front of us. Suddenly, I noticed strange movement at the edge of the field to our left. It seemed as if someone or something was moving among the tall corn stalks. I squinted, trying to get a better look, and then I saw a fleeting figure. It looked like a person, but at the same time, it was clearly different. The figure was too tall, with disproportionately long limbs, and it moved unnaturally, smoothly gliding through the corn. Maybe it was my imagination, but there was definitely someone on the field. I turned abruptly to my father. "There's someone in the field!" Dad, catching the alarm in my voice, instantly jumped up and ran for his rifle. We quickly headed towards the field, alert and ready for any surprises. Pushing through the corn, we heard rustling and steps ahead of us. It seemed something large and fast was moving ahead, leaving a trail of bent and broken stalks. But as we got closer, the figure mysteriously disappeared, leaving only the sun-glimmering corn leaves behind. We returned to the porch, where our half-eaten lunch lay. The desire to eat had completely vanished. Dad kept clutching his rifle, a sense of anxiety hanging in the air. This place was starting to have a definite negative impact on our nervous system. Even my father, who was usually so composed, was visibly tense. The day passed as we tried to distract ourselves from anxious thoughts, and fortunately, no more strange occurrences happened. Day 4. Waking up in the morning, I asked Dad if Mr. Williams had come by. He shook his head no, pointing to the mobile phone lying on the table. Again, just a message. I slumped into a chair, tiredly, and started eating my simple breakfast. Today was the 4th day. Just a little longer, and we could leave this backwater. Instead of a relaxing holiday, we got nerve-wracking days. After breakfast, we decided to take a walk and stretch our legs. Stepping outside, we noticed that there were numerous paw prints all around the house, all belonging to the same species, judging by their shape, but of different sizes. Dad and I exchanged glances. "What the hell is going on here?" he repeated for what seemed like the umpteenth time. We circled the house and realized that a pack of animals, likely wolves judging by the tracks, had roamed here last night. But these tracks were not exactly like those of wolves, slightly different. Dad checked the trap. It was empty. These animals were smarter than we thought. With so many, someone should have been caught. We decided to scout the area, taking the rifle with us, but found nothing. Returning home, we decided to rest. I went to my bedroom, then sat on the bed and pulled out my laptop. It was almost out of charge. The charger was somewhere around. Looking around, I saw it on the floor near the bed. Bending down, I briefly saw a small box under the bed. I reached for it and took it. The box was made of dark wood with fine carvings on the lid, giving it an antique and mysterious appearance. Carefully, I opened the lid. The hinges creaked, almost groaning, revealing its long-hidden secret. Inside the box was an old diary. The diary's cover was worn, its pages yellowed with age, and it seemed to hold stories from the past. I gently picked up the diary. The first page was inscribed in calligraphic handwriting with a name I immediately recognized. It was the name of our uncle who left us this house. In the diary, pages were filled with chaotic, uneven lines. Ink was smeared in places as if his hand trembled while writing. Throughout, there were insertions of incomprehensible symbols and sketches, adding more mystery to the text. I tried to recreate in my mind what my uncle must have felt, reading his entries. May 28th. They are still after me. I feel their gazes when I go out into town. They are not human. Can't be. Their eyes are empty, lifeless, but they watch every step I take. June 1st. I stocked up on weapons today. I must be prepared. At night I hear whispers outside my window. They are coming for me. I'm sure of it. June 5th. The whole town is in cahoots. I can feel it. Every corner, every shadow, they are waiting for me to weaken. June 10th. Tonight I saw them. They were at the edge of my field among the corn. Huge, ominous shadows, upright but not human. I'm not losing my mind. I know it's real. June 15th. I can't sleep anymore. They are everywhere. In the house, in the fields, in town. I must fight. I must survive. Reading these lines, I felt a chill run down my spine. The disorder of the words, the abrupt phrases, and the constant sense of being pursued in every word. It all created an oppressive atmosphere of madness and fear. It became clear that my uncle had experienced deep terror and paranoia, possibly caused by something inexplicable and mystical in this town and its surroundings. Remembering what had happened in this town, I concluded that perhaps what was written in this diary was not just my uncle's sick imagination. I went downstairs and showed the diary to Dad. He read it and was also impressed, then became thoughtful and said that we just had to wait a little longer. The house would be ours. We'd put it up for sale and leave this place as soon as possible. I took the diary to study it more closely, and the day passed unnoticed. Sitting in my bedroom, immersing myself in my uncle's diary, a piercing howl suddenly broke the night silence. The sound was so eerie and unreal that I instantly jumped up, my heart freezing in terror. Dropping the diary on the bed, I rushed outside to find out what was happening. My father was already there, rifle in hand. We ran to the trap we had set earlier, but it was empty. Instead, we found traces of blood and clumps of coarse, dark fur. The scene looked as though a struggle had taken place, but neither the victim nor the predator was there anymore. Suddenly, Dad froze, straining his ears. I followed his gaze and saw something dark moving on the barn roof. We raised our flashlights, and the light fell on something huge and incomprehensible. The figure seemed human, but its proportions were distorted, its contours blurred by darkness. As soon as the flashlight beam touched the creature, it leaped from the roof and disappeared into the tall corn stalks. In an instant, it was gone. Only the rustling of leaves slowly fading into the night. Dad, unable to contain himself, fired in the direction where the figure had vanished. The gunshot tore through the silence, and its echo lingered in the forest for a long time. We stood, holding our breath, but no response came. Only dead silence and the motionless cornstalks, as if guarding their secrets. I looked at Dad and became alarmed. I had never seen such a frightened look on his face. I pulled him by the arm, and we went back inside. I had trouble falling asleep, as tension and stress seemed to build up inside me since we arrived. Whether I could withstand a few more days here was unknown to me. Day 5. Mr. Williams didn't bother to show up, sending the same dry message again. I sat nervously chewing my toast, wondering what this day would bring. Suddenly the phone rang. The sharp, intrusive sound pierced the silence, startling both of us. My father slowly picked up the receiver, his gaze filled with caution and distrust. The room fell into tense silence, with only a distant, barely discernible whisper coming from the phone. It was a whisper mixed with indistinct voices, creating the effect of someone else's presence in the room. I moved closer to hear better. The whisper seemed familiar yet eerily distant. The voices intertwined, creating an unintelligible chorus of threats, groans, and pleas. It seemed as if they were trying to convey something important to us, but their words were lost in obscurity and noise. Dad felt uneasy and abruptly hung up the phone, but the sounds continued to echo in our heads, as if from another world. We stood, shocked and frightened, thinking how terrifying it would be to hear such a thing at night. Dad went outside to clear his head, while I decided to check on the wolf's carcass we had shot, after which all these strange events began. My instinct told me everything was interconnected. Going down to the basement where the refrigerator was, I opened it. To my surprise, it was empty. I ran to ask Dad if he had moved the carcass, but he shook his head no. Together we returned to the basement and looked around, but found nothing. So someone had entered the house at night and taken the wolf. Who could enter the house and carry out the heavy carcass without noise or leaving any trace? And why? Pondering what could have happened, we returned to the kitchen. Dad was visibly nervous, and I opened the fridge to quench my dry throat, noticing our food supplies were running low. I suggested we drive to town. He reluctantly agreed. As we entered the town, we were suddenly captivated by a strange and somber spectacle. A funeral procession was slowly moving down the main street. People dressed in black carried a coffin, surrounded by oppressive silence, broken only by soft whispers and sobs. We parked the pickup on the side of the road and got out to watch the procession. The townspeople, noticing us, began to shy away, exchanging frightened and unfriendly glances. There was a tension in the air, as if we had violated the invisible order of this mournful march. As the procession lined up with us, piercing sobs and cries emerged from the crowd. Suddenly, a woman in black, her face tormented and contorted with grief, ran towards us, pointing and screaming, accusing us of causing her son's death. You are to blame for this. Your actions have awakened the evil that took my child." Her voice was full of despair and rage. Dad tried to calm her down, but she was adamant, her gaze burning with madness and accusation. Other townsfolk gathered around us, their faces filled with suspicion and fear. In their eyes we saw not just grief, but a belief that the horrors occurring in the town were somehow connected to us. We got back into the pickup, feeling the weight of their stares on us. We sat there, puzzled about what we could have done wrong. After buying groceries, we returned home, away from this mad town. Back home, Dad and I discussed whether we should just leave and return to our hometown. Dad called a realtor friend to inquire about the house's value. The realtor, after hearing the description, said it would be around $250,000. We exchanged glances, then Dad suddenly stood up, slapped me on the shoulder and said, "All right, we'll endure a couple more days. In case something happens, we have weapons, and I'm not afraid to make a couple of holes in someone. Dad's confidence gave me strength, and my mood slightly improved. But unfortunately, not for long. In the evening, as darkness enveloped the farm's surroundings, I noticed something strange and terrifying in the cornfield. Among the tall stalks, dozens of glowing eyes were fixedly staring at the house. Their glowing gazes in the darkness created a threatening and at the same time hypnotic spectacle. I called Dad, and he, taking his rifle, went outside to check what was happening. I watched him from the window. As Dad approached the field, the mysterious eyes began to disappear one by one until they completely dissolved into the darkness. He stopped at the edge of the field, trying to discern something in the dark, but there was only the silent sea of corn. When he turned to return home, I suddenly saw the eyes reappear. They flickered like sinister stars, emerging again and again from the darkness, forming a whole constellation of glowing points aimed at Dad. I screamed to warn him, but my voice was lost in the evening air. Dad quickened his pace, looking around, sensing something was wrong. Returning inside, he was pale and tense. His hands trembled as he closed the door behind him. That night, neither of us could sleep. The idea that someone or something was watching us, hiding in the darkness, made our blood run cold. Day 6. This morning I felt completely exhausted. I had hardly slept and my head was throbbing. As we sat at the kitchen table, Dad received the now customary reminder from the lawyer on his phone. We ignored it, then Dad took a mug, which suddenly slipped from his fingers and shattered. I jumped in surprise. My nerves were stretched to the limit. After cleaning up, I decided to rest in my bedroom and soon fell asleep again. I was awoken by some noise in the hallway. It was already dark. Had I slept through the entire day? My room was engulfed in deep, impenetrable darkness, sliced only by a narrow strip of cold light seeping from under the door. A sense of something unseen and threatening hung in the air. My heart stopped when I heard heavy, slow footsteps and deep, animalistic breathing, sounding as if the source was right behind the door. The breathing was rough and uneven, as if belonging to a creature from another world. Gathering my courage, I slowly got up from the bed, each of my steps echoing loudly in the deadly silence. Approaching the door, I hesitated, gripping the handle tightly. Finally, I opened the door. The corridor was empty, lit only by the pale moonlight creating distorted, menacing shadows on the floor. A heavy, oppressive atmosphere hung in the air, as if the darkness itself had become thicker and denser. It seemed the electricity in the house was off. Turning on a flashlight, I cautiously stepped into the corridor. The light beam sharply cut through the darkness, revealing empty rooms shrouded in shadows. I headed to my father's bedroom, my heart pounding in unison with each step. But the bedroom was empty, the bed disheveled as if Dad had suddenly gotten up and left. With each checked room, my anxiety grew. Descending the creaky staircase, where each creak sounded like a death rattle, I entered the living room where the shadows seemed almost tangible. I felt a chill on the back of my neck, as if someone unseen was watching me from the darkness. After searching the kitchen, basement, and barn, I found no trace of my father. Returning inside, I felt fear and loneliness envelop me like cold arms. "Father!" My voice broke the silence of the house, echoing in the empty corridors. But there was no answer, only the hollow echo of my cry. Suddenly, there was a noise behind the door, restless and anxious. I ran outside to see what was happening. The night's darkness enveloped everything, but at the edge of the cornfield, I noticed some movement. Despite my fear, I decided to go there. Approaching the field, I began to make out strange shadows that seemed both human and animalistic. They moved swiftly and silently, like ghosts floating among the corn stalks. My pulse quickened, and fear swirled in my head. Around me, the shadows began to gather closer and closer, creating the impression that I was in the center of some ominous ritual. I tried to run, but my feet got entangled in something on the ground, and I fell face down. Trying to get up, I felt a sharp blow to my head. The world around me spun, sounds faded, and I was plunged into the thick darkness of unconsciousness. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness was a sense of absolute terror and hopelessness, as if I had fallen into the clutches of an unknown predator hunting in this moonless night. Day 7. Waking up from unconsciousness, I immediately felt that my hands and feet were bound, and my eyes were covered with thick fabric. Trying to free myself, I discovered that my movements were restricted, and I couldn't see what was happening around me or break free. "Is anyone here?" I exclaimed, my voice sounding muffled and desperate. In response, my father's voice could be heard. "Son, are you here?" His voice was weak and concerned. I felt relieved knowing that he was alive. "Where are we? What's happening?" I asked. My father explained that someone had knocked him out in the kitchen the previous evening, and he had woken up here, also bound. From the fresh air, I could tell that we were somewhere outside. My attempts to stand were futile, but as I felt the area behind me, I sensed grass and a tree to which we were tied. We spent hours in this state, losing track of time. Thirst and hunger were becoming unbearable, and the inability to relieve ourselves was agonizing. Finally, someone approached and untied our hands. This provided some relief, but we were soon bound again. No one gave us water or food, and we grew weaker by the moment. Suddenly, we were attacked. Invisible hands struck us, and the assailant's voice uttered some incomprehensible language filled with anger and hatred. Each blow was cruel and merciless, every word dripping with rage. After the beating, our legs were untied and we were dragged somewhere. I felt each step as painful and heavy. Unable to see where we were going, I could only feel the cold wind on my face and the menacing silence of our captors. We were brought to a place and the blindfolds were removed. We found ourselves in a clearing surrounded by stones, in the middle of a cornfield where the stalks had been crushed into a huge circle, forming a place for some ominous ritual. We were tied to posts facing each other. Night had enveloped everything in darkness, and the approaching full moon cast its cold rays on the clearing. People we had never seen before gathered around us. They spoke in an unfamiliar language, pointing at us. Their eyes burned with a wild fire, and their movements exuded menace. Suddenly, a man who seemed to be their leader emerged from the crowd. He stood in the center of the clearing and began uttering something that evoked both sadness and joy among the onlookers. After his words, cries filled with some wild energy erupted from the crowd. Then this man approached my father, grabbed a knife, and made an incision on his arm. Blood slowly began to flow, staining the ground. I screamed as I saw my father writhing in pain. The man collected the blood in a cup, raised it above his head, and drank it before starting a strange, wild dance. Others around us joined in, creating a whirlwind of movements as if they were part of some ancient, forgotten ritual. The moon illuminated their faces, distorted by passion and madness. Suddenly, the one who had drunk the blood began to tremble and convulse. His body began to change. Bones shifted with loud cracks. Flesh stretched and covered itself in thick fur. The transformation was gruesome and painful. Before us stood a monster, a werewolf, gigantic and terrifying, with eyes filled with a beastly thirst for blood. One by one, other members of the cult began to transform as well. They growled and howled, their bodies contorting into unimaginable shapes. Around us, a dance of death unfolded, filled with cries and bestial roars. We watched this horrifying spectacle, frozen in terror, waiting for these creatures to pounce on us. The air vibrated with their hungry roars, and the clearing was enveloped in an aura of primal fear and madness. In that moment, it seemed as though the whole world had shrunk to this circle of horror and cruelty, where we were nothing but helpless victims of ancient evil. When the menacing creature, filled with a thirst for blood, loomed over me, ready to strike a deadly blow, its animalistic eyes glowed with menace. I froze in shock, awaiting the inevitable end. But suddenly, the night was shattered by a loud gunshot, and the creature recoiled. We turned and saw the townsfolk, armed to the teeth, ready to confront the unholy. Meister Williams, unexpectedly, was by our side and began to untie the ropes that had bound us. "What's happening here?" I exclaimed in shock and confusion. I convinced the locals to help. It was difficult, but they agreed. "This is not your war. It's a convergence of unfortunate circumstances," he replied, his voice strained. I asked again, unable to believe my ears, and he explained that by shooting the wolf, which turned out to be one of the werewolves, we had disrupted a fragile truce. In my mind, gears were turning. Before our arrival, there had been some kind of uneasy peace here, but a hunting accident seemed to have put an end to it, prompting the werewolves to seek revenge. I remembered the looks, the funerals, the werewolves. I would never have believed it if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. The battle raged on around us. Suddenly, I saw the cashier from the store who had always served us, fighting bare-handed, defending herself against the creatures. But then something unexpected happened. Her body began to tremble, and right in front of me she transformed into a werewolf. I was shocked. It meant that the townspeople were not ordinary humans either. After transforming, she rushed into the battle, sinking her teeth into an opponent's throat. I turned away in disgust. The villagers around us also began to change their forms, but unlike our captors, they had a different shape and color. They appeared more beautiful. We got up and ran. Mr. Williams, carrying my father on his shoulder, led us to safety. But suddenly, he stopped and turned back to look at the battle. Then he made a decision. "I have to help my own kind," he said, handing my father to me. My father was quite heavy, but I carried him with all my strength. For a moment I turned back and saw that our elegant lawyer was transforming, tearing his clothes apart as he changed into something else. I continued to run, the sounds of battle, cries and roars growing distant. Finally, I emerged from the field and ran to the pickup truck. Fortunately, it was not locked. Loading my father onto the passenger seat, I checked the bandage that Mr. Williams had managed to apply and rushed to get the keys. Finding the keys, I jumped into the pickup and floored the gas pedal. I had to save my father, who had lost a lot of blood. Glancing in the rearview mirror, I took one last look at the house and realized that I would never return there.
Story 3.
Ice Shelf. 10:43 a.m. "Come in," Stokes said without looking up from the map spread out on the wide wooden table. He hadn't slept for 2 nights and didn't care if it sounded rude. The work schedule approved by the Hook Petroleum Board of Directors was hopelessly delayed, and now David was doing everything he could to make up for the time lost, due to the Arctic storm that had been raging for 3 days. The door creaked open. John McKinley, the head of the second team of geologists, squeezed into the room with difficulty. McKinley was about 35 but looked older, possibly due to his impressive size. John looked more like a giant wrestler than a geologist. Among the expedition members, he was known for his strength and good nature, which did not prevent him from being demanding and sometimes tough on his subordinates. But now, his thick jacket was heavily covered with snow, and a crust of ice had formed on his black and graying beard and around his mouth. "Excuse me, sir." McKinley was breathing heavily from his quick pace. David looked up from the map with some annoyance, but immediately realized something had happened. The giant was nervously shifting from foot to foot and was clearly alarmed. "Yes, John, speak." "We have a problem?" McKinley's deep voice filled the room. "During work on the shelf, one of the workers fell into a crevice." Stokes closed his eyes for a moment. He had wanted to wait out the storm at the base for a reason. He had a bad feeling. "Who?" "Harry Cole. He's one of the new guys, been here just a couple of weeks." "I know who Cole is, John." Stokes frowned. "What's his status? Did you get him out?" "That's the problem, sir. We can't find him." "Why?" McKinley hesitated and sighed. "Well, it's not a typical crevice." "What do you mean, not typical? Speak clearly." The foreman bit his lip, trying to find the right words. "You see, sir." He finally forced out and wiped his broad palm across his forehead. "It's not like a regular crevice. It's a huge cavity. We tried to look into it from above, but we can't see anything, not even the slopes. Without equipment, we can't find him." "Understood." Stokes wearily ran his hand over his face. "What about the radio?" "Silent." David sighed heavily. "When did this happen?" "At 9:30 a.m. John wiped his hand again. "I left Frank there in case Cole contacts us." Stokes thought for a moment and looked at his watch. "How many people are at the base right now?" "The first team is still here, sir. They're scheduled to leave in an hour. So besides us, there are 4 more." "Okay. Can you mark the location on the map?" McKinley quickly crossed the room and approached the table, leaving wet footprints on the wooden floor. He bent over the map, traced his finger over it, and nodded confidently. "It's here, sir." His finger pointed to a spot about 1.5 miles west of their base camp. A hole in the ice, a little over 3 feet. Probably, the ice shifted after our work. Stokes carefully examined the point indicated by the foreman. On snowmobiles, especially in this hellish weather, it would take about 40 minutes to get there. But they had to hurry. Cole wouldn't survive long in the cold if they wasted time. Since the Arctic was opened for mineral extraction, many oil giants had rushed here, and Hook Petroleum was one of them. However, before placing equipment on the vast, snowy expanses, companies sent groups of geologists to precisely determine the boundaries of the oil deposits. They tried to follow safety protocols, but the managers often cut costs, leading to several worker and engineer deaths each year. These incidents were carefully hidden from various commissions. But even if the state showed interest in a particular incident, money always did its job, and it was quickly forgotten. Stokes had worked for the company for many years and knew that the management would prefer a purely formal approach to rescue operations. But his subordinates respected him precisely because they could rely on him in any situation. He valued his people, and they were ready to do anything to work with him. Stokes ran his hand over his face again and rubbed his tired eyes. He desperately wanted to sleep and was practically collapsing from exhaustion. A couple of hours of sleep. "Call Bradley to me," he finally said quietly, "and prepare the equipment for 3 people with Steve, a couple of generators, and 3 powerful spotlights. Tell Stevie that he's coming with us and warn the rest of the guys. We're leaving in 15 minutes. Yes, sir. McKinley gave him a quick, apologetic glance, nodded, and heavily left the room. Stokes looked at the map again and pondered. The 50-degree frost almost gave Cole no chance of survival, and a fall from a great height practically reduced those chances to 0. But he believed in luck. Once, 20 years ago, he had also been lying at the bottom of a 30-foot crevice on the slope of Elbrus, unable to move even a finger, and the vast world had become for him only a distant, unattainable piece of blue sky overhead. Life was ending, like water in a glass being drunk in greedy gulps. But he was found and saved. Only scars reminded him of that fall, and also a half-forgotten feeling of that insane joy experienced by a person who had lost all hope. A new knock on the door made David startle and return from the past. Joe Bradley, the head of the first team, entered the room. Unlike the giant McKinley, he was lean, of average height, and not at all good-natured. A former Marine, Bradley had a tough character, which Joe, fortunately for many, more than compensated for with military discipline. David had been working with him for several years and trusted him as much as himself. Are you aware? Stokes stepped away from the table and stopped a short distance from Bradley. The floorboards creaked under his boots. Yes, sir. McKinley told me about Harry. I hope the guy is alive. So do I, though the chances are slim, but I called you for something else. Stokes stepped closer. I have a request, Joe. If the company finds out we're undertaking a hopeless rescue operation in the face of a scheduled delay, they'll skin us alive. Bradley nodded in agreement. Make sure the guys don't talk too much afterward, especially over the radio. Understood, sir. Excellent. Stokes patted him on the shoulder and looked at his watch. I think John's ready. You're coming with us. I need your help. Let's go. 12:50 p.m. We're here, sir. McKinley's voice was barely audible in the speaker amid static and gusts of icy wind. Got it, John. Stop, guys. Stokes stopped the snowmobile. The powerful engine growled a couple of times and died. He straightened his stiff back with relief, wiped the snow from his glasses with his fingers, and looked around. Visibility was no more than 15 feet, and the sun barely broke through the haze of thick snowflakes. To the right, the other snowmobiles were visible, and ahead, about 20 feet away, the faint outline of a red tent could be seen, its canvas walls billowing under the fierce gusts of wind. A lone figure stood near the entrance. Stokes got off the snowmobile and only then noticed the fence of bright red flags a little away from the tent. Damn. He shook his head in disapproval. It was against safety regulations to leave people so close to crevasses. McKinley had been asking for a reprimand for a while. Frank? It's Stokes, he almost shouted into the radio. Do you hear me? There was static and clicking. Yes, sir. Step away from the tent and join the others. Understood, sir. The snow-covered figure slowly moved towards the snowmobiles. Bradley? I hear you, sir. More static. Take the rope, tie it to one of the machines, then approach the flags. Be careful, Joe. Yes, sir. Stokes headed towards the fence. Walking was difficult. The wind beat against his chest in tight jerks, and he struggled to stay on his feet to avoid collapsing into the snow. He saw the hole immediately. It loomed ominously in the ice between the flags and was exactly as McKinley had described it, no more than 3 feet in diameter. David approached closer and crouched. Around its edges he could see thick, about a foot thick dark gray ice dusted with snow. It was definitely not a crevice or a crack. David thought it looked more like a hole that kids poke in an eggshell with a thick needle. He turned over his shoulder. Bradley was already standing 5 feet behind, waiting for orders. "Throw the rope and secure me," he shouted. "I want to take a closer look at this damn hole." Bradley nodded, swung wide, and threw the end of the rope to him. Stokes stood up, wrapped the rope tightly around his chest a few times, then clicked the carabiner shut, crouched again, and crawled towards the edge. He crawled cautiously, not wanting to accidentally collapse this dome of snow and ice. His suspicions had already grown into absolute certainty. It was indeed a dome that could hide an enormous crater of an ancient extinct volcano beneath it. If this were the case, they needed to exercise maximum caution to avoid all falling in after poor Cole. Finally, he stopped at the edge and looked down, clutching the uneven edge of the ice with his fingers. Below him yawned absolute darkness. It stretched in all directions, and for a moment Stokes felt as if he were lying on the edge of the world, looking into an infinite abyss where there was neither time nor space. Only darkness and terrible cold. He stared in fascination at the white snow swirling above this black void, driven by sharp gusts of wind, slowly descending into it until it completely disappeared into the bottomless depth. He had to shake his head to snap out of it. Something terrifying and dreadful was in this sight. He turned on the flashlight. The bright beam cut through the darkness and went down like a thin needle under the lower edge of the ice. David hoped to see part of a stone wall or an icy slope, but no. The beam gradually extended into the distance and dissipated, as if devoured by thick, viscous darkness. He crawled closer to the edge, hung his hand down, and began to move the flashlight side to side, trying to see at least something in this pitch-black darkness. Again, nothing. David rolled onto his back and grabbed the radio. Harry. Harry Cole. Over. He waited a few seconds and repeated. Cole. It's Stokes. Over. Cole. Cole. Respond. The static in the radio intensified, but the air was silent. Cole either couldn't respond or was already dead. In any case, David had to make a decision, and he did. Stokes lay on his side and waved his hand towards the snowmobiles where McKinley stood. "John?" he shouted into the radio. "Yes, sir? I'm going down. Joe will secure me." Bradley waved his hand, confirming he heard. "Keep calling Cole. If we're lucky, I'll notice his radio or hear it when I'm descending." "Got it, sir." Stokes got on his knees and removed the rope from his chest. He needed to put on special equipment for the descent. Otherwise, the tight loop would just break his ribs. Then he pulled safety harnesses from his belt pouch, put them on, tugged hard, tightening the fastenings and simultaneously checking their reliability. Then he clipped the carabiner to the safety ring and started feeding the rope down. "Joe, give me 30 feet." "Yes, sir. 30. The rope slowly disappeared into the darkness. 5 feet. The storm was gradually subsiding, and the snow no longer lashed at his face so fiercely. 20 feet. Stokes squeezed and unclenched his hands several times to warm his palms. "Ready, sir. 30 feet. Bradley's voice reached Stokes as if from afar. He was staring into the black, bottomless depth. A bad feeling squeezed his heart with cold again. 1:35 p.m. He was surrounded by complete silence from all sides. David even felt a faint ringing in his ears. A long time ago, in his youth, he read that it was normal and that we usually don't notice it due to louder sounds. But if we find ourselves in silence, then we hear it and think something is wrong with us. David smiled at his thoughts, trying to relax a bit and calm his trembling. He was hanging 10 feet below the breach. The sounds of the storm and the whole familiar world were somewhere above. Light still penetrated here, but it quickly got lost in the darkness, dissolving in it like a drop of paint in a jar of water. For a moment, Stokes even thought he was very much like bait lowered here for an unknown, hungry monster. And right now, deep down, a giant grinning face would flash, greedy eyes would gleam, and in a second it would all be over. David involuntarily pulled up his legs and shivered. He knew how to endure fear, and it often saved his life. But now his fear was different. It was not ordinary fear. It was fear of the unknown. Fear of what awaited him down there, in the terrible black depth. Cole, over. McKinley's voice came through the speaker. Cole, over. Slowly swinging on the rope, Stokes pointed the flashlight upward. The spot of light slid over the icy dome, reflecting off tiny crystals in bright splashes. For a second, the beam caught a black surface, and he quickly brought the flashlight back. Incredible. His hand gripped the flashlight and started moving in a circle around the hole, through which the snow was slowly flickering in the dim light, falling. It seemed that the ice-covered sparkling dome hung in the air without any support. But looking closely, Stokes realized that the ice layers lay on an absolutely black base, extending far to the sides, forming another even larger dome. Cole, over, Cole. The voice in static came through the speaker again. David once more swept the beam over the black dome. It extended at least 30 feet and practically merged with the surrounding darkness. Bradley, over. Radio noise. I hear you, sir. Bradley's voice was interrupted by static. Give me another 30 feet. Yes, sir. The rope slowly and smoothly went down with Stokes, and the hole in the ice began to recede, gradually shrinking in size. He leaned down and waved the beam beneath him. There was still no sign of the bottom, but it was already clear that Cole was dead. No one would have survived a fall even from such a height. He continued to glide down, feeling not only fear but also some curiosity, like a child who is terribly afraid of what awaits ahead but keeps running further, unable to stop. Stokes nervously glanced around, trying to catch in the flashlight's beam at least a faint hint that the bottom was near or that the walls were narrowing towards the center, as in a volcano crater. The 30 feet ended, and the rope stopped. He was already 40 feet deep. Cole, McKinley's voice sounded again. Cole, respond. Again, silence. Stokes slowly swung side to side in the pitch-black darkness. The tightly stretched rope creaked slightly. There was still no sign of the bottom below. Bradley, feed another 30 feet. Over. Yes, sir. Another 30. The rope went down again. 5, 10, 15 feet. Stop, Stokes suddenly breathed out. Something white flashed far below and then vanished into the darkness. 2:20 p.m. The descent ended. Stokes unhooked the carabiner and felt relief as his feet touched a solid surface. The last half hour felt like an eternity to David. But he finally reached the bottom of the cave and now stood knee-deep in snow, exhaling thick white vapor into the icy air. No light penetrated here. If he turned off the flashlight, everything around would plunge into absolute darkness and complete silence. There was no snowstorm here, not even wind, but it was just as cold as above. David looked up. The hole was over 120 feet above, looking like a small star against the night sky. He stood on a large, roughly 50 by 50 feet, snow-covered platform. The deep snow reached his waist in some places. He thought the snow had been lying here for centuries, maybe much longer. He felt eerie about this place. Never in his life had David seen anything remotely like this cave. The flashlight's beam still got lost in the distance, not reaching any obstacles. Perhaps the reason was the rock in which the cave was made. absolutely black stone seemed not to reflect light at all but absorbed it, like a sponge. Stokes realized the cave was man-made during the descent when he saw almost perfectly even ground beneath the snowdrifts, made of huge black blocks. 15 feet to the right, a large dark red stain was visible on the pristine snow. That was Cole's body. He lay with his arms wide apart and his neck and left leg twisted unnaturally. Harry Cole no longer needed help. He was dead. But David was interested in something else. He was interested in what accidentally caught the flashlight's beam and completely changed all his plans. 3:10 p.m. McKinley. Bradley, do you hear me? Over. The radio static grew stronger, then completely subsided. Bradley, McKinley. Over clicks and a sharp sound like a siren. Another loud click. We hear you, sir. It's Bradley. Found Cole. He's dead. Stokes paused a little. I need to look around. I'll be in touch in 10 minutes. Understood, sir. In 10 minutes. The snow crunched loudly under Stokes's feet as he moved forward. A few feet ahead, the flashlight's beam picked out what had so intrigued him. A huge obelisk, about 15 feet high, glittering with ice and snow crystals, not far from Cole's body. Stokes approached the obelisk, stopped, and began moving the bright beam over its surface, carefully examining every detail of this unusual structure. Indeed, it had somewhat strange outlines for an obelisk. Its base rose about 2 feet and was shaped like a square with sides about 10 feet. On one side, under the snow, the outlines of wide steps were discernible. At the base stood an enormous cube over 7 feet tall, one corner of which, closest to the center of the cave, was cut diagonally, and almost in the center of this cut, either another smaller cube or a sphere rose. The outlines of this object, and the cube itself, were hidden under a thick layer of snow and ice. Stokes exhaled white vapor and looked around again. The enormous size of this cave both frightened and attracted him. He was curious about what lay further. In the darkness. He circled the obelisk and headed toward the edge of the snow, visible about 30 feet to the right. Walking was difficult. Ice lay beneath the snow, causing Stokes' feet to constantly slip, and he expended a lot of energy to keep his balance and not fall into the snow. A couple of times he did fall, but he got up and kept going. Finally, he reached his destination. The snow was shallow and barely covered the black stone blocks. David shone his flashlight on them, then squatted down, took off his thick glove, and ran his hand over the stones. The surface was rough and very cold. He had encountered this material before. The huge blocks were carved from black obsidian volcanic glass, but he had never seen such dark stone. The largest deposits of obsidian were in the US and Mexico, but here in the Arctic it couldn't be unless it was brought here deliberately. But in such quantities, and by whom? Stokes stood up and pointed the flashlight into the distance. The dark blocks extended further in all directions and were lost in the darkness. He felt scared again. Bradley, over. Yes, sir, I hear you. We're staying here for now. What happened? I can't explain. You need to see this. Understood, sir. Silence returned. Stokes stood in place for another minute, peering into the dense darkness ahead of him, then turned and cautiously made his way back to the obelisk. 4:55 p.m. What is this? McKinley looked around with curiosity and, at the same time, with apprehension. He tried to speak loudly to drown out the noise from the generators. I don't know. Stokes walked over to him and stood beside him. 2 spotlights brightly illuminated the pedestal and part of the cube itself, while the third was aimed at the cave walls. Damn, Bradley exhaled. He stood a few steps away, strong surprise etched in his gray eyes. David had never seen him so agitated. The size of the cave was colossal. The light barely reached the black walls, whose outlines were faintly visible about 300 feet away. The cave floor, within sight, was laid with incredibly black and uniform obsidian slabs. "Yeah, you could fit several football fields in here," McKinley shivered. "I don't like this at all, boss." Bradley frowned at him and then turned to Stokes. "Dave, we need to report this to the leadership. If they find out we're hiding something..." He paused, waiting for an answer. "I know the protocol, Joe. They'll wait. We have nothing so far except the body of poor Cole." Stokes surveyed the obelisk. "We don't even know what this is." He approached the base of the obelisk and forcefully ran his gloved hand over its surface several times. Snow crunched and fell off. David leaned closer, hoping to see something under the layer of snow and ice. But the ice was too thick, and nothing was visible. So he stepped back a bit and struck the surface of the obelisk hard with the heel of his boot several times. There was a crunch. The ice cracked, and thick mat pieces fell loudly into the snow. "Damn!" Stokes bent down, closely examining the chipped area. "Damn," he repeated slowly, shaking his head. "This can't be." Footsteps sounded behind him, and Stokes saw a cloud of vapor over his shoulder. "Oh my God," McKinley breathed out, his eyes wide open. Silence followed, broken only by the strained hum of the generators. "Joe," Stokes was the first to recover. "How many heaters do we have left?" "2 more." McKinley's voice trembled with excitement. "Bring them here. And a couple more generators, quickly." "Understood, sir." Stokes bent over the chip again. Under the thick layer of ice, gold gleamed faintly. 8:35 p.m. Another piece of ice loudly fell away from the base, revealing a new section of the structure. Stokes no longer doubted that the entire platform and, probably, the cube itself were made of large blocks of pure gold. He couldn't even estimate how many tons of precious metal there were. 2,000, 3, or maybe 10. David had heard somewhere that Fort Knox held nearly 3,000 tons, and the same amount, maybe more, was right before them. Bradley also seemed to understand what the obelisk was and nervously bit his lips as he examined it. Marty, whom Stokes had urgently called from the station, stood with Steve behind McKinley, quietly and anxiously talking about something. David saw it in their tense faces and the glances they occasionally threw at him and the obelisk. He had left 2 more people above. Frank was securing them at the breach near the equipment, and Tom was on duty at the base to cover them in case of any issues with the management. Another piece of ice crashed onto the stone floor, and another. The heaters were operating at full power. Stokes had them placed around the base of the obelisk and near the cube. While the ice was melting only at the bottom, thin streams of water had just begun to run from the cube. David hadn't decided what they would do with this find, but they had few options. According to protocol, he was obligated to immediately report the incident to his superiors. Of course, the company would give them something as a bonus, but Stokes was absolutely sure that each of them would regret it for the rest of their lives. Or, he thought, they might be able to come to an agreement among themselves. And then there was a slim chance that they could extract all the gold independently. David had connections and hoped to use them if necessary. But he knew that this decision carried great risk because if the venture failed, they would all be out of the company and never be able to work in any major company again. But that wasn't the only thing occupying his thoughts. They still had no idea what they had found or what the cube itself was, positioned on the huge pedestal. The snow on its surface had already begun to melt, and the cube looked as if it were covered with a giant patchwork quilt. Where there was no snow, a thick, shiny layer of ice was visible. What had recently been thin streams of water had already turned into rivulets, quickly running down the wide steps and pooling in clear puddles below. There was a crack. A large fissure appeared on one of the facets, and a moment later, another chunk of ice crashed down, revealing the golden surface. David looked closer. The newly exposed part of the cube was not made of blocks, but was a single monolith, covered with some markings and patterns. Behind him came a loud exclamation. Steve had apparently just realized what the huge structure was made of. Damn. The boy's eyes widened as he took off his glove and ran his hand over the golden wall. Is this gold plating? There must be 100 kilograms here. It's not gold plating, it's solid gold, David said quietly, continuing to carefully examine the strange symbols. Silence fell. Stokes smirked, imagining how the guy's eyes widened again. He climbed the stairs, carefully stepping over thick chunks of ice, and approached the place where the signs were carved. Now David could make out squares, triangles, circles, and other strange symbols that didn't resemble any known script. "Help me," he said loudly, and struck the ice hard several times with the heavy handle of his flashlight. Bradley and McKinley ran up the steps and stood beside him. The others gathered closer to the corners. There were more blows against the ice. Faster. Faster. Stokes wiped sweat from his forehead with his sleeve and looked at the others. Everyone was gripped by some wild excitement, and each blow left deep dents with white streaks in the ice. He couldn't tell how much time had passed, but suddenly there was a crash, and a huge chunk of ice fell heavily, scattering a cloud of glittering shards. Marty slipped in surprise and fell flat on his back, spreading his arms wide. His flashlight flew far to the side and stuck in the snow. There were joyful shouts and loud laughter. Stokes looked around. Everyone else was on their feet, shaking off snow and ice with eyes gleaming with excitement. Marty, already joking, fell into the snow again, and the guys laughed loudly. His gaze fell on Steve. He stood still, staring at something around the corner of the cube. His face showed confusion and vague anxiety. "Steve?" Stokes called out loudly with a chuckle. "What's over there?" The boy silently raised his hand and pointed to the base of the cube. His face had turned pale. The others also quieted down and stared at what Steve was pointing to. "Oh my God," McKinley said quietly. "What is that?" Stokes walked over to Steve. At first he didn't understand what it was. On one facet, where the ice had fallen away, a golden surface covered with droplets of water was revealed, and on the other, adjacent, from under the him, Stokes felt that the thirst for gold was even weaker than the desire to see the one who had spent thousands of years in the darkness. Bradley's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. "Sir, I'm ready." He stood next to the giant leg, firmly holding the rope, which was thrown over the back of the throne and secured at his waist. The other end of the rope was in the hands of Steve and Martin. They stood on the opposite side of the cube, waiting for Stokes' signal. "Okay. Lift him up." David motioned with his hand. The rope tightened sharply, and Bradley began to climb, gripping the cracks in the ice. With a few agile movements, he quickly rose to the level of the giant's chest. He slipped, painfully hitting the ice with his hands. He straightened up again, trying to maintain his balance. "Stop!" Stokes waved his hand again. The rope froze in place, holding Bradley from falling. He looked down and smiled. "Guys, anyone brought shorts? It's hot up here." Someone snorted in the radio, followed by muffled laughter. Bradley turned to the giant and, not hurrying, calculating each move, forcefully kicked the ice layer in front of him several times. There was a crack, and another large piece fell. revealing an enormous belly covered in thick, dirty fur. The entire upper part of the body remained hidden under a layer of ice. A heavy, musty smell hit his nose. Joe stood on the thick folds of fat. They were dense and springy. What did this creature eat? He had a wild thought for a second, but he immediately dismissed it. Bradley tried to reach the upper edge of the ice covering the rest of the giant. He couldn't. He put away the flashlight and grabbed the rope again. "Lift me higher." His voice in the radio was broken by static. The rope slowly moved up. Joe leaned back slightly, and with small steps, continued to climb. Everyone silently watched his movements. After a few minutes, he managed to secure himself on the broad chest. He took out his flashlight again, and finally had a look around. In front of him was a huge, ice-covered head. It was at least 8 or 9 feet in size. Under the ice, the thick fur could be faintly seen, with no hint of a face or a snout of an intelligent creature or animal. The ice layer on the right was significantly thinner than in other places. Bradley swung and struck hard with the handle. There was a crack, and a wide fissure ran from the very top to the giant's chest. The ice block hit the edge of the throne heavily, slid down a bit, and stopped. He squinted and leaned closer, trying to see something under the ice, but the spotlight beam hit at an angle, and everything inside the crack was in shadow. "Joe, what do you see?" McKinley was already showing impatience. "Wait a second." Bradley turned on the flashlight and directed the beam inside the crack. The ice was indeed still thick, but water had already formed underneath it. It trickled down the dirty, matted fur and dripped onto the enormous belly. Joe immediately noticed 3 strange black stripes on the head, crossing the fur from one edge of the crack to the other, and looking like shallow folds. Each fold was 12 to 16 inches apart. He leaned closer, slipped his hand into the crack, and carefully touched one of them. At that moment, a wild expression of horror distorted his face. Joe jerked back and, like a fish, began to gasp for air. The folds all opened simultaneously, and 3 huge, shapeless eyes stared at him. Everything else happened in a matter of seconds. There was a deafening crack. Sharp ice shards rained down on Bradley. Heavy chunks fell and trapped his thigh, breaking his leg at the knee. Simultaneously, a massive shadow blocked the spotlight from the left, and a heavy blow to the back like a blunt ram pressed him into the ice. Ribs cracked. He could no longer breathe. His face was forcefully pressed into the hard, like concrete, icy wall. Another push to the back. Ice and bones crunched simultaneously. A new flash of blinding pain shot through his brain. Joe's body, like a rag doll, snapped at the spine with a dry click and quickly disappeared into the black, foul-smelling hole at the bottom of the werewolf's head. 9:53 p.m. Stokes froze in horror. He had just seen Bradley disappear into the werewolf's mouth. The jaws snapped shut with a wet crunch, and streams of blood spattered the dirty white fur of its face and belly. The werewolf swallowed heavily and, lifting its head, roared hoarsely. Everyone scattered in different directions. Stokes fell into the snow and quickly, in a panic, crawled behind the nearest spotlight. His heart was pounding in tight, rapid beats. Blood pulsed in his temples, tearing his head apart. God, what is this? He was breathing heavily, releasing thick vapor into the snow. The spotlight was hot from long use, and it was almost impossible to stay behind it. His entire body and face were covered in sweat. David held his breath and cautiously peeked out. The werewolf was still sitting in the spotlight, its thick, pillar-like legs spread wide, and sharply lifting its head, it inhaled the air noisily. The musky smell from the huge, dirty body filled the entire area. Stokes barely held back his nausea with frequent, shallow breaths. The more Stokes looked at the creature, the more he began to tremble. He could no longer control it, and a wave of wild, primal fear washed over him. A guttural roar sounded again. Everything about the creature's appearance was terrifying. Its body was covered in thick, long fur of a dirty white or rather grayish color. Stokes had seen such fur before on old polar bears. Large bloodstains shone bright red on its chin, chest, and part of its belly. The body was fat, but despite the hanging folds and the huge, protruding belly, it looked powerful and very strong. The remnants of ice crashed down from the throne. What instilled the most fear wasn't even the creature's gigantic size and strength, but its paws and head. Instead of forearms, incredibly thick and long claws hung from its elbow joints. Like the rest of the body, they were covered with fur. Their thickness was staggering, and the surface was dotted with growths that even the dense fur couldn't hide. The werewolf's right claws, splattered with red, hung carelessly from the armrest, with blood dripping and mixing with the melting water on the pedestal. But the head. Stokes began to shake just from looking at it. It was even more repulsive than the two huge claws. The thick fur on it was matted and compressed from being under ice for so long. It wasn't even round, but somewhat flattened in the front, with two large bony growths on the sides where the ears should have been. The werewolf turned its head toward David. Its huge mouth, almost half of its face, was round and looked like a bottomless pit. A guttural roar echoed. For a moment, bare red gums and sharp triangular teeth lining the entire inner surface of the throat appeared. And suddenly, a new wave of terror overcame him. David involuntarily jerked and feverishly tried to press himself into the small space behind the spotlight. He was so overwhelmed by the sight of the werewolf that he only now noticed its eyes. Rather, all three pairs of eyes. They were arranged from top to bottom, three on each side. Large, filled with animal rage and greed, they looked at him wild, merciless, and insane. 10:05 p.m. The werewolf abruptly lifted its head and noisily sniffed the air with its flat, wide nostrils. David realized that it was sniffing for scents, meaning it couldn't see him yet. His throat was dry from the adrenaline rush, and he swallowed convulsively. The generators continued to hum monotonously. The sharp smell of diesel fuel was as strong as the musky scent, and perhaps the only thing that had saved their lives so far. Stokes held his breath and cautiously propped himself up on his elbows. The snow creaked faintly. He stretched his neck as far as his cover allowed and looked around. The bright light illuminated the throne with the werewolf, and beyond, about 15 feet from the pedestal, twilight began. Further still was complete darkness. He prayed that none of the guys would come on the radio now, especially Frank, who stayed above. Any sound would mean death for any of them. The werewolf sniffed loudly and growled in displeasure. David's mind raced. They couldn't run to the ropes. The werewolf would rip them apart or trample them halfway. Even if they managed, they wouldn't climb more than 10 feet. There was a noise again. The werewolf turned its entire body to the right and lifted its head, eagerly sniffing something. Stokes looked in the same direction and realized what had attracted the monster's attention. Nearby lay Cole's flattened body, likely emitting a strong scent of blood. Chunks of ice fell, and one of the blocks hit the edge of the pedestal with a dull thud, breaking into pieces, miraculously missing the right spotlight. The werewolf clumsily and with great difficulty began to rise to its feet, tearing its fur, frozen solid to the ice, from the throne. It swayed from side to side several times, roared in displeasure, and suddenly raised its paws with those horrifying claws. Stokes hunched his shoulders, his eyes widening in fear. His whole body became limp and weak. This couldn't be. There was something unnatural about it. His mind desperately resisted the horrific sight. This mix of different species combined in the nightmarish fantasy of a bad dream. The creature lowered its paws onto the back and armrests of the throne. Even under the thick fur, it was visible how its enormous muscles tensed. Another effort. The ice cracked. It fully straightened on the pedestal, then pushed its chest forward, pulling its paws back, and walked heavily towards Cole's body. Stokes' nerves were at their limit. It was clear they were trapped. His heart pounded loudly in his chest. His throat was so dry that his tongue felt like sandpaper. The footsteps stopped. The werewolf stood over the body like a mountain. Even from here, Stokes could see the red bloodstains on the snow and the pale, miraculously preserved hand with broken fingers sticking awkwardly upward. One of the claws slowly lowered. It moved in strange jerks as if trying to feel something in the air. Then it froze in place, and suddenly darted down, grabbing Cole's body, lifting it sharply to the open mouth, and greedily shoving it inside. The jaws snapped shut, and the sound of bones crunching was heard. The werewolf swallowed again, then roared deafeningly, lifting its head. Stokes curled into a ball, pulled his legs tightly to his chest, and covered his ears with his hands. He was trembling violently. 10:15 p.m. He managed to pull himself together only after a few seconds. Something crashed loudly nearby, and the spotlight suddenly went out. There was a wild scream and the sound of running footsteps. David cautiously lifted his head. One of the generators lay 30 feet away, its metal casing severely deformed. The werewolf stood 45 feet to the left, chest pushed forward, head raised, and wide nostrils flaring. The footsteps faded, and a shadow flickered at the edge of the light and darkness. In that instant, the werewolf darted towards the fading sounds with heavy but quick steps. In a few seconds, it covered the distance and disappeared into the darkness. Stokes propped himself up on his elbows and listened. The silence didn't last long. Suddenly, it was pierced by a scream of wild terror and pain. When it fell silent, Stokes heard with horror the same greedy, guttural growl, followed by a loud, prolonged roar. 10:23 p.m. Stokes. The radio suddenly came to life, and a voice trembling with fear and interrupted by static was heard. David flinched in surprise. He didn't recognize who was speaking. The fear had altered the person's voice beyond recognition. "Who's this?" he almost whispered. "It's McKinley." Stokes covered the radio with his hand and listened. Silence surrounded him. The werewolf had either gone deeper into the cave or was hiding somewhere in the darkness. "Got it, John. Who was that?" "Martin. Seems like he snapped from fear and couldn't handle it." "What do we do, David?" McKinley managed to pull himself together. "I have an idea, John. Guys, who else is listening?" "This is Steve." "Frank." Frank's radio signal was heavily interrupted by static. A dissatisfied roar sounded somewhere in the distance. "Steve, John, can you see the ropes well?" "I see them, Dave." "Yes, sir." "Frank? Listening, sir?" "Jerk one of the ropes to make it swing." "On it, sir." There was a pause. A few seconds later, one of the ropes jerked slightly and started swinging slowly from side to side. "Okay, Frank. Did everyone see the rope?" "Yes." "Yes, sir. Now listen to me carefully." Stokes tried to speak very quickly. "In at most 2 hours, we'll freeze to death here, so we'll try to get out. Frank, you get on the snowmobile that this rope is tied to and start it." "Understood, sir." "Now for you guys. As soon as Frank is ready, one of you runs to the rope and wraps it around yourself. As soon as I give the command to Frank, he quickly drives 100 yards. As soon as he gets one of you up, we repeat everything." He fell silent. The radio was silent. "Might work, Dave," McKinley's voice finally said. "I'm in." "Steve?" "Me too." "Frank, did you hear everything?" "Yes, sir." "Can you do it?" "I won't let you down, sir." "Great. Which one of you, John?" There was a pause. "Think quickly, guys. No time." "Steve," McKinley decided. "Okay, Steve, get ready." "Yes, sir." 10:30 p.m. go. Stokes saw a shadow detach from the base of the throne, and then Steve appeared in the spotlight, running like a rabbit towards the ropes. The snow creaked under his feet, and white clumps flew in all directions. He had to cover 60 feet. He slipped, fell, hitting his palm. Blood splattered. Got up again. For a moment he appeared in the spotlight and grabbed the rope. Steve's face showed horror. He frantically wrapped the rope around himself, waved his hand. "Lift," Stokes exhaled into the radio. Steve's body jerked and shot upwards. And at that moment, a monstrous bulk emerged from the darkness with incredible speed, and a huge claw grabbed Steve in midair at the waist. There was a horrific scream that was almost immediately drowned out by a deafening animal roar. The werewolf yanked the man down towards its mouth, but feeling the resistance of the rope, it took several steps back and yanked again. Following this, there was a dry, loud crack from above, and a moment later, snow and chunks of ice rained down. And a second later, something large crashed heavily into the rocks with a forceful impact, breaking into several shapeless pieces. The werewolf turned its head towards the sound, but immediately turned back and greedily shoved the still-living, writhing and screaming Steve into its open maw. The screams abruptly stopped, followed by the sound of bones crunching. Stokes' eyes widened in horror, but he wasn't looking at what was left of the snowmobile or even Steve's death. David was looking at McKinley, who was crouched behind another spotlight, and at Frank's body, which lay 10 feet from him. 10:39 p.m. A roar echoed. McKinley pressed his entire body against the back of the spotlight and pulled his legs up. Even through the thick clothing, he felt the unbearable heat of the metal. He couldn't last long, but he had to try. He didn't want to be torn apart. Just the thought of it made John break out in a sweat. He closed his eyes and began to pray. Heavy footsteps sounded behind him, as if someone was pounding concrete pillars into the stone. The hairs on his body stood on end, adrenaline surged, and his terrified heart pounded wildly in his chest like a heavy hammer. The footsteps stopped, and heavy, raspy breathing was heard nearby. The smell of fresh blood and animal stench covered John like a thick, palpable cloud. He covered his mouth with his hand, suppressing his nausea. Tears stood in his fear-widened eyes. God. God. The words pulsed in his crazed mind. John couldn't think. He could barely breathe. He wanted to shrink to the size of a pea or become invisible. The sound of a heavy blow. A guttural growl. A new wave of stench hit him. Something clicked painfully, and a wet crunch of bones followed. He closed his eyes. The crunch continued. John felt he was about to lose consciousness. Black spots danced before his eyes, and his head spun. The rustle of fur. The werewolf swallowed heavily, and suddenly, it became noisy, as if a huge pump was sucking in air through its nose. In that same second, the spotlight flew to the side with a loud clang, catching John's jacket sleeve and spinning him in place. He lay on his back, unable to move or even open his eyes to look directly ahead. His whole body trembled wildly with fear, and his teeth chattered, locking his jaws into cramps. Time froze and turned into a viscous eternity. Finally, he slowly opened his eyes. First, he saw two huge, dirty, fur-covered legs, a belly and chest, bloated with fat and covered with large bloodstains. Something dripped onto his forehead and trickled down his cheek. He looked up and froze, paralyzed with terror. Right above him was the giant head, swaying. The werewolf leaned forward slightly, spreading its massive claws wide and shaking them menacingly. Its face was red with blood, and the fur had clumped into long, ugly icicles. The head turned slightly to the right. John thought the monster was listening for something. Suddenly, one of the claws jerked downward, but stopped and hung a couple of feet above him. The head turned again in the opposite direction, a dissatisfied growl. McKinley feared to breathe and only took shallow breaths through his mouth. The werewolf's monstrous head lowered closer. Now it was no more than 10 feet from the lying man. The nostrils moved again, the mouth opened slightly, and saliva mixed with blood dripped onto John. He couldn't hold it anymore. He screamed, wildly, loudly, with his mouth wide open and eyes bulging. First from fear, then from pain. A furry claw shot down, crushing his body as if it were a paper wrapper, and with a few crunching movements it was shoved into the hungry maw, lifeless and limp, and silence fell again. 10:47 p.m. Stokes rolled onto his back and clutched his head. He breathed quickly and raggedly to suppress his nausea. John's death was wild and horrific. He suddenly turned onto his side and buried his face in the snow. He vomited. It felt a bit better. Wiping the saliva with his sleeve, he cautiously propped himself up on his elbows and peeked out from behind the spotlight. The werewolf was still in the same place, slowly turning from side to side, sometimes lifting its head and sniffing greedily with its wide pink nostrils. All the snow in front of it was splattered with blood. Stokes' pulse was racing, pounding in his temples with tight waves. Moreover, the extended time spent in the snow was starting to take its toll. His hands and feet were gradually going numb from the cold. In at most 2 hours, if he didn't do something, he wouldn't be able to move and would soon freeze to death. Suddenly, David realized he had missed something important. He tried to calm down and started breathing slower. His thoughts flashed like a kaleidoscope. It couldn't be. A flash of insight shot through his mind. He froze, not yet fully believing his guess. This couldn't be. This couldn't be. He looked around. About a yard to the right lay a small piece of the snowmobile's casing, and that was exactly the kind of item he needed now. Small and heavy enough. Stokes cautiously lay down in the snow, trying not to make any loud sounds, then stretched out his right hand and hooked the icy metal edge with his frozen fingers. Damn. His hand slipped. He had to stretch a little further, and only then could he grab the ribbed edge and pull the metal closer to him. He hid again behind the cooling spotlight. The werewolf stood sideways to him, no more than 60 feet away. The light from the remaining spotlights illuminated only the face and part of the chest. This made it look even more terrifying. The beast sniffed the air again, raising its muzzle, then snorted loudly several times and growled in displeasure, releasing a cloud of thick vapor from its mouth. Stokes hesitated. His shoulders and back were shaking so badly that his hands trembled and his neck tensed. He took a deep breath, closing his eyes. Again and again. He held his breath, feeling his body fill with a sense of calm. The trembling began to subside. He exhaled and opened his eyes. He wasn't entirely sure what he was about to do. Maybe he was making a mistake, the last one of his life. Stokes stood up and straightened. The snow creaked. The werewolf turned sharply at the sound, took a quick step and froze. David didn't move. He stared directly at the beast, into its eyes. The enormous head tilted to one side, then the other. The beast noisily sniffed the air, exhaled irritably, pulled its paws back, pushed its chest forward, and roared deafeningly at the man. Stokes' ears popped, but he didn't flinch and remained standing. I'm right. It can't see. It can only hear and smell. His heart pounded wildly from a fresh wave of adrenaline. The werewolf listened again, froze for a second as if thinking, then suddenly rushed at him, claws wide apart. In 3 steps, it covered half the distance. It was enormous. Stokes' hair stood on end. It was incredibly enormous. Another moment, and... as if in a fog, he lifted his unsteady hand with the piece of metal and hurled it with all his might to the side. There was a crash. The beast froze 15 feet from the man and spun around. A thunderous roar echoed, and the massive form lunged toward the sound. David closed his eyes, exhausted, his arms and legs trembling, his back and forehead covered in sticky sweat. There was a prolonged screech of metal. Something heavy scraped against the stones. A loud thud. Something large fell into the snow nearby and rolled over several times. Heavy footsteps. A roar. Another screech of mangled metal, and another thud. Suddenly, there was silence. 11:10 p.m. David didn't know how much time had passed. 5 minutes or much more. He remained standing, drenched in cold sweat and afraid to move. His legs were tired and freezing again. He desperately wanted to take off his boots and rub his numb toes with warm hands. He would do it, but first, he had to survive. Stokes swallowed hard. His throat was dry, and he was very thirsty. His breathing had turned into a thin stream. To avoid making noise, he inhaled in small sips and exhaled just as gently. He could only breathe through his mouth, as his nose was blocked from the intense vomiting. From the depths of the darkness came the wheezing breath of the beast, and he could only guess where it was now. While the generators were running, Stokes had a chance to reach the ropes unnoticed, but now everything had changed. In the ensuing silence, any sound, even the crunch of snow, would cost him his life. David slowly moved his right hand to the place on his belt where the flashlight was attached. There was a rustle of canvas. Damn jacket. He stopped and listened. It seemed to him that the beast's breathing had become quieter. His heart pounded so hard it seemed it would burst through his chest. Just don't make a noise. Stokes' hand reached for the flashlight again. The frozen canvas rustled treacherously, but much quieter this time. Panic was growing inside him. He suddenly remembered the old movie Jaws, which he had watched as a child. The film had made such a strong impression on him that for many years afterward, David had panic attacks when swimming in dark, murky water. And now childhood fears of the unknown made every cell in his body tremble again. His hand touched the flashlight. He carefully pulled it from its holder. A large drop of sweat rolled down his forehead to his eyebrow and hung there heavily. Stokes slowly brought the flashlight to his chest, then raised his left hand and grasped the ribbed handle. Now turn it on. He licked his dry lips. Turning on the flashlight wasn't easy. David remembered with horror that the button made a loud click. To calm himself, he took a deep, careful breath. Then he covered the button with the thick glove, gripping the flashlight handle, and slowly squeezed his hand. After a few seconds, the button clicked silently, and a bright beam of light shot upward. The werewolf was already in another place, much to the left. It crouched and moved in small, silent steps. Its dirty belly hung almost to the stones, and the claws were spread wide and swayed grotesquely with each step. There was something painfully repulsive about this creeping beast, especially the black, blood-covered face which dropped down and sniffed the air after each step. Oh God. A sharp cramp suddenly seized David's leg. He bit his lip hard to keep from screaming. The pain was unbearable. He arched his back, barely maintaining his balance. The cramp passed as suddenly as it had come, but the terrible realization that he was freezing set in. Meanwhile, the beast had moved further. Stokes tried not to look at its horrifying movements. He only occasionally shone the flashlight in its direction, catching the massive form from the darkness and trying not to lose sight of it. His mind was racing. The flashlight's battery would last at most half an hour, and then he would face complete darkness and a horrible death. The sharp smell of diesel suddenly hit his nose. Stokes looked around. The mangled generator lay about 10 yards to the right. From the beast's powerful blow, it had split almost in half, and a large pool of dark, viscous liquid had formed under it. David shone the flashlight in the beast's direction again. It continued moving and was now almost behind the throne. Its movement strongly resembled a spiral pattern. If that was the case, the beast would be near him in about 10 minutes, Stokes thought. His gaze returned to the diesel fuel. He could try to set it on fire, but the chances of it igniting on the first try were slim, and yes, to hell with it. He dismissed all thoughts and sprinted to the generator like a sprinter, dropping his thick gloves and pulling an old lighter from his pocket. 2 huge steps, and Stokes fell to his knees next to the mangled metal. He paid no attention to the pain from the impact. A thunderous roar echoed, followed by heavy footsteps. Stokes frantically struck the lighter over the pool of diesel. The flame went out, flared again. His hands trembled, sweat pouring down his face. There was still some liquid in the torn tank, and David quickly stuck his hand in. Suddenly the flame flared along with his sleeve. He pulled his hand out of the tank, ran to the side, and fell into the snow. In the same instant, a huge claw closed on the flaming generator. There was a screech of metal. It flew up, and then a deafening roar of pain shook the air. Stokes' ears were temporarily deafened, but he jumped to his feet and ran to the ropes. David had never run so fast in his life, not even when showing off in college to impress the girls. He sprinted in huge leaps, waving the flashlight in all directions. Something fell behind him and exploded. Thick gray smoke began to rise. Stokes didn't look back. He reached the hanging ropes, grabbed one of them, and quickly unclipped the ascender from his belt. He attached it to the rope and began climbing up hastily. 6 feet. The rope was stained with blood, and the ascender slipped sharply down. 9 feet. He looked toward the beast. It was persistently trying to approach the flaming generator, but kept backing away and roaring with rage. The fur on its right claw was severely singed and hung in charred, brownish-black clumps. 15 feet. Stokes' pulse had long exceeded all conceivable limits. His temples throbbed with a tight, pulsing pain. 24 feet. The rope jerked, and he sank a bit, swaying from side to side. 30 feet. Suddenly there was silence. He didn't realize it at first. When he did, cold sweat broke out. 11:35 p.m. Stokes stopped and froze, listening to the ringing silence. There wasn't a sound from below. Only the quiet creak of the rope, stretched under his weight, could be heard. The werewolf was hiding somewhere below, unseen due to the thick haze rising almost to David's feet. He cautiously leaned down and peered into the swirling smoke with its acrid, heavy smell. He could see at most 15 feet. Beyond that, the flashlight beam was lost in the grim depths. Stokes feared to move and just breathed heavily. releasing clouds of white vapor into the icy air. To the left and slightly below, the top of the throne was visible, around which gray smoke also lazily swirled. The beam slid across its dull golden surface and then dissolved again into the darkness. His nerves had long been on edge, and only his iron will allowed David to hold on and not fall into despair. The sound of blood in his ears grew louder, gradually drowning out all other noises. It was terrifying beyond measure. He dangled in the air, swaying slightly, once again feeling like bait on a huge hook. The rope creaked again. Stokes raised his head and shone the flashlight upward. The thin line disappeared into infinity, and only it connected him to the outside world. Another creak. He moved his numb hand higher and looked up again. His gaze slid into the darkness, then down the rope, and froze. His heart thudded a few more times and clenched into a tight knot. Not this. He slowly lowered his head and looked down, at the rope he was hanging on, its end lost in the gray haze, directly below him. God, I forgot to pull it up. Stokes gripped the ascender with his left hand and cautiously reached down with his right. His hand trembled with fear. He tried to calm himself. Inhale. His frozen fingers touched the rope. Exhale. His hand grasped the rope and carefully began to pull it up. Inhale. He looped the rope over his neck, lowered his hand again, and pulled up the next section, looped it over his neck. His breathing steadied. Stokes slowly and silently pulled the rope up, loop by loop. His fingers were so numb they moved with difficulty. Finally, David wrapped the last loop around himself, leaned back slightly to keep from spinning, and put his hands in his jacket pockets, feeling the saving warmth spread through his icy fingers. He closed his eyes for a second, just for a second. And then the unexpected happened. The rope jerked and suddenly dropped half a foot, the sharp jolt causing the flashlight to fly out of its holder, spin several times in the air, and fall into the snow, hitting the stones with a loud thud. David quickly pulled his hands from his pockets, grabbed the rope frantically, and froze, swaying slightly from side to side. Miraculously, the flashlight survived. It stuck out of the snow, still shining a bright beam upward. David held his breath, listening intently to the oppressive silence. The seconds stretched into eternity. He looked around cautiously, and suddenly, the hair on Stokes' head stood on end. In the haze where the beam of light was directed, a dense, dark silhouette appeared first, and then the werewolf emerged from the mist. It walked slowly, stopping after each step, listening carefully to the silence, and moving its head in strange, unnatural jerks. At the level of Stokes' legs, there were no more than 5 feet between the man and the beast. A hoarse, muffled growl was heard. The beast took 2 more steps and stopped again. They were now only 2 feet apart. 1 more step, and David could have touched it with his hand. The werewolf lifted its head and turned it toward the man. The flashlight illuminated the snarling face from below, but it was clear to see the blood-splattered fur, the grotesque growths on its head, and the huge half-open mouth, from which a heavy, rotten, meat-like breath emanated. The beast slowly inhaled, and then snorted loudly, splattering Stokes with murky saliva, growling discontentedly. It tried to sniff the air again, but exhaled noisily once more. Diesel is masking the scents, David guessed. It can only hear. He pressed his lips tightly and cautiously began breathing through his nose. It was much quieter, but the air wasn't enough, and he felt he wouldn't last long. Suddenly, the werewolf extended its snout toward Stokes, coming almost right up to his knees. Now only half a foot separated them. David turned pale with fear. The blood drained from his face, and he clung to the rope, nearly losing consciousness. A burst of vapor escaped the wide nostrils. The blind, absolutely black tarantula-like eyes seemed to be scrutinizing his body, ready to devour it greedily in a moment. His heart stopped. David was about to scream wildly, but he couldn't tear his gaze away from the enormous blood-covered snout and insane eyes. The scream stuck somewhere in his throat and his eyes bulged. The next instant, one of the claws shot up and snapped shut with a loud click just a few inches from Stokes' boot. Then slowly lowered, and a thunderous roar filled the cave. The werewolf turned. There was a faint crunch of the flashlight, and everything plunged into darkness. 12:15 a.m. Stokes came to himself only at the top. With difficulty, he rolled onto his back and stared at the dark sky with empty, lifeless eyes. He lay in the snow. The storm had nearly subsided, and the moon appeared in the sky. David didn't remember climbing the rope, clutching it with frost-bitten hands and tearing his palms to the flesh, nor how he had clawed at the ice with broken nails and crawled out, then quickly crawled away from the edge and lost consciousness. The skin on his face hung in tatters, but he didn't feel pain. Now he didn't feel anything at all. David rolled onto his stomach and struggled to his knees. Then, with trembling hands, he pulled out a hunting knife with a broad blade, crawled to the edge of the hole, and with several strong blows, cut through first one rope, then the other. They slid down like snakes and disappeared into the black depths. A prolonged roar echoed from the darkness. Stokes paid it no attention. He got up and staggered toward the nearest snowmobile. The snow had nearly buried all the machines and the tent, turning them into white mounds. Another couple of hours, and there would be no trace left of them. The snowmobile started easily and roared off. He didn't know what he would tell Tom or write in the report, but he knew one thing for sure. He would never tell anyone what really happened here.